In the course of my long lifetime, I have seen the meaning of the word poetry change. At the beginning of this century, the name of poet was honored with the corresponding expectation from the poets of what I would venture to call food for the soul, meaning and values, beauty and wisdom, of a kind which poetry and the other arts have traditionally been held to be the proper language. In, I suppose, every civilization before our own, knowledge has been concerned with such values, facts of mind, to use Coleridge's phrase, rather than facts of the material world, those immeasurable meanings and qualities with which human beings have been concerned at all times until a materialist science redefined reality in terms of the measurable and rational thought based on observable facts of an objective world. The reign of quantity, as it has been defined by the metaphysician René Guénon in the title of a well-known book in which he challenges this still prevalent mode of thought. The modern movement of the early part of this century was in many ways the equivalent in the arts of the materialist worldview of modern science, whose boundaries virtually preclude values of former and other civilizations, since these are immeasurable and therefore without reality in terms of scientific knowledge. The age-old search for truth and beauty has been replaced by the observable, the immediate, and the process of change as values in themselves. Thus, the meaning of the words poetry and poet have become emptied of those meanings they once implied, possessing no authority of vision or wisdom or inspiration of any perception of, in Blake's words, eternal things displayed. The poet has no authority beyond that of any other professional user of words, the journalist, the politician, or any other recorder of information, and the name no longer merits the honor it once bestowed. Of course, this is a generalization, there are exceptions, but the prevailing climate of this civilization does not favor works of the imagination. There's a prevailing rejection, or perhaps more truly ignorance, of those regions of the mind which are the true sources of poetry. It is perhaps not surprising that it is an Indian critic, India being the last great spiritually grounded civilization, Professor Ramesh Chandra Shah of Bhopal University, who asked the question, has the traditionally valid expectation of a special and indispensable kind of wisdom from poets become untenable in today's cosmopolitan civilization? Is it nothing more than a superior entertainment, as T.S. Eliot would have us believe? Yeats remains a poet in the traditional sense, as an inspired speaker of wisdom, of truths and realities of the imagination, sealed with the mark of beauty, a word seldom used in modern discussion of the arts, as something irrelevant to the recording of the grim or trivial realities of the daily secular world, nowadays called the real world. Eliot's The Waste Land is his lament for the passing of these traditional values, and his four quartets an attempt to recreate them on that wasteland. Yeats declares himself of the older tradition. We were the last romantics, chose for theme traditional sanctity and loveliness. Whatever's written in what poets name the book of the people, whatever most can bless the mind of man, or elevate a rhyme. But all is changed, that high horse riderless, though mounted in that saddle Homer rode, where the swan drifts upon the darkening flood. Pegasus, the winged horse of inspiration, is riderless, and the swan, ancient symbol of the soul, drifts upon a darkening flood. The filthy modern tide, as Yeats elsewhere writes, the waste land, the darkening flood. These two great poets were prophetic. Eliot has described as the waste land an experience we can all deeply recognize. But Yeats saw the poet's task, as did his master William Blake, as being not to reflect the age, but to inspire it, to illuminate every age with a vision of higher realities, these being timeless and always accessible to those who raise their minds to those regions, raise their thoughts to heaven, as Blake so simply puts it. Contemporary preoccupation with the commonplace as such, deliberate ordinariness, simply is not in these terms poetry at all, for not only does it not originate in those higher regions of the mind or the soul of the world, it negates the very existence of these. This is an age for which nothing is sacred, for a material order of objective facts is devoid of values, whereas for poets of the imagination, to use Blake's resounding words, everything that lives is holy. For science, there are no meanings or values, only facts. For the imagination, the song of the universe is holy, holy, holy. There is even a school of literary criticism which would exclude value judgments, since for those who equate knowledge with measurable information, values of any kind are not a category. In contrast, for those for whom not matter but mind is the primary reality, it is otherwise. For experience continually evaluates. Poetry and the other arts are the basic modalities of human thought, not knowledge about, but knowledge of the thing itself, as music is itself its own meaning. Beethoven's quartets are not about anything. They are themselves the immediate communication of meaning, as indeed are the poems of any imaginatively inspired poet. Imaginative knowledge is immediate knowledge, like a tree or a rose or a waterfall or sun or stars. In contrast with the positivist school, I have used the phrase, the learning of the imagination, for the process of learning from, not about, those monuments of unaging intellect, as Yeats describes the records of human wisdom and beauty embodied in the arts and philosophy. What then is that special and indispensable kind of wisdom described by the word imagination? The great French Ismaili scholar Henri Corbin, basing his definition on the Sufi writers, especially on the work of Ibn Arabi, has coined the term imaginal, to describe that order of reality proper to the imagination, since the word imaginary is in popular usage understood as something unreal. The word imaginal is the equivalent of the alam al-mithal, I don't know how to pronounce it. Perhaps Shusha could tell me. Of the
alam misal,
yes.
realm of masal.
Thank you.
Image.
Yes. Of the Persian philosophers of the imagination described by Corbin as that region of the mind where meaning takes on form, and by the same agency, forms take on meaning. The imagination as understood by the Romantic poets is nothing less than the fundamental ground of knowledge. Coleridge, you will remember, in his famous definition, defines imagination in these words, which I'm sure you all know, or if you don't, you should. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all perception and the reflection in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Western philosophy has been slow to discover what in the Indian schools is axiomatic, the presence within the finite self of the transcendent divine self, the living principle known as Satchit Ananda, being consciousness bliss. This is Coleridge's living power and prime agent, which naive materialism has been slow to discover, although now it is obvious in terms even of science that an observing mind is the necessary condition for every observation. Coleridge's definition comes as close as it has hitherto been possible in the West to an affirmation of the universal ground of a God within. Coleridge, in his later years, withdrew into the religious snare of Christian theology, from what as a poet he knew. Ted Hughes's remarkable essay on Coleridge, which has just been published by Faber's, will tell you what I mean about that, and what Coleridge knew as a poet. Blake, more courageous, or perhaps simply more clear-sighted, equates imagination or the poetic genius with the God within, and that God within he calls Jesus. For him, Jesus was not the historical person of exoteric Christianity, but the divine humanity present in all humankind. Hence his term, Jesus the Imagination. Jesus is God, he wrote, and by this he meant imagination is God. His startling term, Jesus the Imagination, is the equivalent of the transcendent self of Vedanta, the Sat Chit Ananda of being itself. If Western philosophers might accept being and consciousness, only Blake would have understood that the third term, bliss, ananda, is in the very nature of being itself. Life delights in life, Blake writes. The soul of sweet delight can never be defiled. That is where poetry is a special contribution to the understanding of fundamental knowledge lies. And trees and birds and beasts and men, behold their eternal joy. Arise, you little glancing wings, and sing your infant joy. Arise and drink your bliss, for everything that lives is holy. If reality is an experience and not an object in space, it is a realm of values, of which the supreme value is the sense of the holy, the realm of the sacred. For lack of an adequate metaphysical structure, such as India possesses, the Romantic poets had to find their own terms in which to affirm the innate transcendent presence. Coleridge looked to the German philosophers, Blake to Emanuel Swedenborg, from whom he took the name and concept of his divine humanity. However, he made himself dazzlingly clear by the very simplicity of his affirmation. The imagination is not a state, it is the human existence itself, he wrote. Affection and love become a state when divided from imagination. The memory is a state always, and the reason is a state, created to be annihilated and a new ratio created. Whatever can be created can be annihilated. Forms cannot. The oak is cut down by the axe, the lamb falls by the knife, but their forms eternal exist forever. And Blake's Jerusalem concludes with an eloquent description of the creative power of imagination in the four worlds of the senses, feeling, reason, and vision, the four living creatures, chariots of divine, humanity divine, incomprehensible, in beautiful paradises expand. These are the four rivers of paradise, and the four faces of humanity, fronting the four cardinal points of heaven, going forward, forward irresistible, from eternity to eternity. In visions, in expanses of memory and intellect, creating space, creating time, according to the wonders divine of human imagination, throughout all three regions immense of childhood, manhood, and old age. There is no limit to the creative expansion of imagination. Coleridge's repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. For Blake, the human imagination is the infinite I am. As for the authors of the Upanishads, Yeats, who as a young man was the first editor of Blake's prophetic books, was familiar with these definitions of the imagination, and from the Romantic poets, and Blake especially, his spiritual journey led him, one might say, by an inevitable progression to the Upanishads, of which, with his spiritual teacher Sri Purohit Swami, he made the very beautiful translations published in 1937. At the time when Yeats, as a young man, in collaboration with his father's friend Edwin J. Ellis, was editing Blake's prophetic books. He was also studying the writings of Blake's own masters, Jacob Boehme, Emanuel Swedenborg, and more especially Swedenborg's spiritual diaries, which have become fundamental source material for the work of psychical research begun during the 19th century, and in which Yeats himself became deeply interested, and in which he experimented over many years. This is not an aspect of Swedenborg's work in which Blake was greatly interested, though there are records of Blake's own experiences of the spirit world of the discarnate. On the death of his brother Robert, Blake saw his released soul ascending from the body and clapping his hands for joy. And his illustrations to Young's Night Thoughts show in a number of plates the spiritual forms of the dying rising from their mortal bodies. Blake totally rejected the materialist philosophy, already becoming dominant in his lifetime, and so did Yeats. Blake was a naturally gifted visionary and speaks of expanding or contracting his exalted senses as if it were the easiest thing in the world. Yeats knew otherwise, yet the whole purpose of his labor was to attain that vision. I had an unshakable conviction, he wrote, rising how or whence I cannot tell, that invisible gates would open, as they had opened for Blake, as they opened for Swedenborg, as they opened for Boehme, and that this philosophy would find its manuals of devotion in all imaginative literature. As for those manuals of devotion, we discover throughout his writings both poetry and the marvelous critical and biographical writings, and inner vision, whose theme is inspiration itself, allusions, both direct and implicit, to a whole context of works of literature, history, and philosophy comprising Yeats's sacred books. He was widely and deeply read in both English and European literature and beyond. From the English poets he most loved, Blake and Shelley, Spenser and William Morris, to the paintings of Rossetti and Samuel Palmer, and certain novels of Balzac, to Dante, the Japanese No Theatre, and the 1001 Nights. Together with these, he made a study, with Lady Gregory's help, of the oral tradition of Western Ireland, the Jewish and Christian Kabbalah, the communications of mediums. His range of study went far beyond the prescribed limits of any university syllabus in pursuit of the learning of imagination. Where got I that truth? Out of a medium's mouth. Out of nothing it came, out of the forest loam, out of the dark night where lay the crowns of Nineveh. Erudition is scrupulous in the checking of sources, dates, and facts, but the checking of truth is another matter. It can be checked only by imagination itself. Writing in 1928 in his introduction to the second extensively rewritten edition of A Vision, Yeats records that, "The other day Lady Gregory said to me, 'You are a much better educated man than you were 10 years ago, and much more powerful in argument.' And I put the tower and the winding stair into evidence to show that my poetry has gained in self-possession and power." He goes on to describe the beginning of a period of mediumistic communications received through his wife over a period of years. And I quote, "Apart from 2 or 3 of the principal Platonic dialogues," he goes on to say, "I knew no philosophy, and that arguments with his skeptical father had drawn me from speculation to the direct experience of the mystics," citing Blake, Swedenborg, and Boehme. For many years he had been active in psychical research, and as a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, he had done disciplined practical work in Kabbalistic magic. When he began to receive communications leading to the composition of A Vision, his spirit instructors encouraged him to read history and biography. in order that I might give concrete expression to their abstract thought. He also read Berkeley, and from his wife's library 2 or 3 volumes of Wundt, part of Hegel's Logic, all Thomas Taylor's Plotinus, a Latin work of Pico della Mirandola, a great deal of medieval mysticism. I read all McKenna's incomparable translation of Plotinus, some of it several times, and went from Plotinus to his predecessors and his successors, whether they were on her, that is his wife's, list or not. And for 4 years now I've read nothing else except now and then some story of theft and murder to clear my head at night. In other words, detective novels. Although the more I read, the better did I understand what I had been taught. I found neither the geometrical symbolism or anything else that would have inspired it except the vortices of Empedocles. This list of Yeats's exceptions to his ignorance of philosophy would make a list longer than many a scholar's store of learning. Even so, we must take seriously Yeats's words when he writes that his readings were undertaken in order to confirm the communications of his invisible instructors. The learning of the imagination is not a matter of studying the imagination in the light of his extensive and deep reading, as in academia, but the scanning of written sources in the light of those mysterious communications from the deeps of the mind, the truth that comes out of a medium's mouth, or any rich, dark nothing, as he writes in The Gyres. I know now that revelation is from the self, but from that age-long memoried self that shapes the elaborate shell of the mollusk and the child in the womb, then that teaches the birds to make their nests, and that genius is a crisis that joins that buried self for certain moments to our trivial daily mind. Is not this only an elaborate confirmation of Plato's teaching that all knowledge comes from recollection of what we already know, by anamnesis, of what the universal self of the divine humanity already and forever knows, or the prophetic soul of the great world dreaming of things to come? It was in pursuit specifically of imaginative knowledge that Yeats set himself to study in a learned school, and with the same purpose that he set himself to expand his mind by magical techniques taught by the Hermetic Society of the Golden Dawn and by psychical research. He visited many mediums over many years before, following his marriage, the discovery that his wife George possessed mediumistic gifts. She was herself a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, and I remember her telling me with some pride that it was she who had brought the works of Thomas Taylor the Platonists with her when they married. Yeats was concerned only with imaginative thought, not at all with the discursive rational thought on which modern Western civilization is grounded. In his autobiographies, he wrote a declaration of faith clear enough for those concerned with the learning of imagination, and not easy, one might have thought, to brush aside, even by those determined to brush aside what they themselves deemed irrelevant. I am very religious, he wrote, and deprived by Huxley and Tyndall, whom I detested, of the simple-minded religion of my childhood, I had made a new religion, almost an infallible church, of poetic tradition, of fardel of stories and of personages and of emotions, inseparable from their first expression, passed on from generation to generation by poets and painters, with some help from philosophers and theologians. I wished for a world where I could discover this tradition perpetually, and not in pictures and poems only, but in tiles round the chimney-piece and in the hangings that kept out the draught. I had even created a dogma, because these imaginary people are created out of the deepest instinct of man to be his measure and norm. Whatever I can imagine those mouths speaking may be the nearest I can go to truth. When I listened, they seemed always to speak of one thing only. They, their loves, every incident of their lives was steeped in the supernatural. It's not surprising that Yeats's great work for Ireland, with the creation of the Abbey Theatre, with Gordon Craig, the designer of its stage, and its galaxy of playwrights, Synge, O'Casey, Lady Gregory, and the rest, to write words for those imaginary mouths to speak. And here I should point out that Yeats places the poets above the philosophers and theologians as the speakers of truth. Plato's three essential categories, the good, the true, and the beautiful, are represented by theologians, the philosophers, and the poets. As in India, Satchitananda has its equivalent in the three values of Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram, with Sundaram, beauty, corresponding to Ananda, bliss. Philosophy and theology may recognize truth and goodness, but have little to say about Ananda and of beauty, which is its corresponding expression. Yeats here sees the former as merely of some help to the task of the poet and painter, which is to create beauty, to speak its language, and in whose absence the arts have little to offer. Beauty is for the poet the supreme wisdom, that special and indispensable kind of wisdom it has from time immemorial been the offering, which has from time immemorial been the offering of the poets. When my generation as students first read Eliot's The Waste Land, we were impressed by its difficulty, and a whole academic generation busied themselves with following up the notes to that poem which Eliot himself provides. From Jessie Weston's work on the Grail legend, the sermons of Lancelot Andrewes, the plays of Webster, the works of Dante, Julian and Norwich, and the French symbolist poets, Eliot was indeed mapping out what he saw as the territory of his own poetic domain, and that relevant to his time and place in history, whose points of reference fall for the most part within the mainstream of European history, and mainly Christendom. Universities find it very easy to teach Eliot, and in so doing to mark out the frontiers of a known world. Eliot, too, makes his appeal to tradition, but he uses the word in a mainly historical sense. But Yeats uses the word tradition in a metaphysical sense, to signify that learning of the imagination which derives its authority from the vision of eternal things displayed, as Blake, as always, luminously defines it. History has little to do with it. Yeats provides us with no notes, though the terrain he mapped out is no less precise and more extensive than Eliot's. He does not so much display as conceal the immense field of his learning of the imagination in literature and the visual arts, in philosophy and history. He disguises profound metaphysics and essential clues and indications, signposts in casual allusions, so that they are not apparent to the ignorant, but immediately illuminating to those who have begun to discover the landmarks in the terrain of the learning of the imagination. I remember the distinguished art historian Edgar Wind pointing this out and comparing Yeats in this respect to Botticelli, who disguised philosophic learning under the airy light vesture of the Muses and the Graces. We can read Yeats's work from beginning to end without noticing these learned clues to Porphyry's De Antonine Forum, Empedocles and Plotinus, to Gandhara Buddhist sculpture, or even to Blake and Shelley. We recognize his clues only as we ourselves become capable of doing so, and although the great territory of his learning may add to our understanding and our delight in his work, we can delight in it without knowing about the golden birds in the artificial trees of the Emperor of Byzantium, or the great-rooted blossomer of Kabir, the tree whose root is in God, or of Porphyry's honey of generation. that throws the soul about to enter this world into forgetfulness of its eternal nature. Yeats writes in his introduction to the second version of a vision addressed to Ezra Pound of the arbitrary, harsh and difficult symbolism that has almost always accompanied expression that unites the sleeping and the waking mind. One remembers I'm so sorry. One remembers the 6 wings of Daniel's angels, the Pythagorean numbers, a venerated book in the Kabbalah, where the beard of God winds in and out among the stars, its hairs all numbered. Those complicated tables that Kelly saw in Dr. Dee's Black Scrying Stone, and the diagrams of Law's Burma, where one lifts a flap of paper to discover both human entrails and the starry heavens. William Blake thought those diagrams worthy of Michelangelo, but remains himself almost unintelligible because he never drew the like. We can, those hard symbolic bones under the skin, substitute for a treatise on logic, the Divine Comedy, or some little song about a rose, or be content to live our thought. The treatise on logic is, of course, Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, whose theology underlies Dante's poem. What a rich scattering of clues to be followed through many regions of human arts and thoughts, and none leads to a dead end, all open into rich domains of knowledge and wisdom for whoever follows them. These are not a display of recondite knowledge for its own sake, nor the kind of clues that academia likes to follow from one known source to another, but what a prospect Yeats opens to his devotees, whole worlds of knowledge excluded from our habitual fields of study. He spreads out before us like scattered treasures of the world's riches of beauty and wisdom, inviting us to explore unknown regions of mental worlds. And the final object of all these things is spiritual knowledge and understanding, is wisdom, the wisdom of beauty, of the little song about a rose that enables us to live our thought. Between Eliot and Yeats lies a watershed of civilization. When Eliot crossed the Atlantic before the First World War, he discovered in England and in Europe the treasury of an old civilization still precariously intact, already discovered by Henry James and his generation, at a time when the great American collectors of the works of the Impressionist painters were made, and later came the symbolists, the cubists, and the surrealists, who've had such a profound influence in the United States. This was a period of great creativity also in poetry and literature, and the period before the Second World War, the years of entre-deux-guerres, was to see the beginning of the end of the old European civilization, the beginning of the modern movement, and the publication of The Waste Land and Eliot's other early work, which foresees and experiences the breakup of Europe's cultural greatness and foretells a new dark age of barbarism. It is with the European experience that Eliot was to identify himself, and in his choice of the European religion, Christianity. Great poet as he was, his work has justified his choice of that great past. His work partakes of the values of Christendom. It is moral, religious, and grounded in history. Its background is the modern secular world he so well understood, both as American and from his chosen European perspective. As a student at Harvard, Eliot had made some study of Sanskrit and of Indian philosophy, and there are allusions to the Bhagavad Gita, both in the Waste Land and in the Four Quartets. But Christendom, he believed, provided the shared language in which he could best communicate with his readers. Thus we find that the allusions to history and to literature in Eliot are mainly from European and Christian sources, to Dante, Shakespeare, the Grail legends, the poetry and devotional literature of the English 17th century, and so on. Asked by the Chilean poetess Gabriela Mistral on her visit to England on the occasion of her award of the Nobel Prize why he had abandoned his early studies in Indian philosophy, Eliot replied that he would have had to learn another language. Clearly he did not mean Sanskrit as such, but was speaking of the poetic language of a shared culture, and the language of Christendom he saw as that shared context to which he belonged. Both Eliot and Yeats are world poets, and Eliot's popularity at Indian universities is proof enough that where Western civilization travels, his work is studied and understood. But Yeats saw the future, as indeed he saw the present, not in terms of Christendom, with its historical and religious context, and its bent towards secular materialism and scientific studies, but in terms of that Oriental philosophy whose premises are quite other. Not matter, but mind is, according to that philosophic tradition, the basis and ground of reality, and all knowledge takes its origin not from measurement, but from experience. This, in India, seems as axiomatic as do the materialist premises to the modern West. Whereas to the modern Western materialist civilization, knowledge consists in the accumulation and organizing of information from the external world, for the Oriental philosophy, knowledge is obtained by extending the frontiers and changing the perception of the mind itself. The scientific in contrast with the imaginative ways of approaching reality. There has always been in the West an excluded tradition of imaginative knowledge, and as we have seen, Yeats was deeply versed in this Western esoteric tradition. And although Western technological culture is everywhere penetrating India and the Far East, Yeats nevertheless saw what Jocelyn Godwin, in a recent book called The Theosophical Enlightenment, as the strongest current of change in the modern West. This is taking place in many forms, from the opening of the unconscious realms of the mind by studies of psychology, to the many schools of yoga and Eastern forms of meditation at present spreading in the West. Eliot placed himself within the Western cultural and religious tradition with its emphasis on faith, morals, and social order. Yeats throughout his life was drawn rather to the Oriental path of spiritual enlightenment and wisdom, described by Yeats's one-time friend A.K. Kumaraswamy as knowledge absolute, the goal to which religions are themselves only ways and means. Yeats's early master, William Blake, had written that all religions are one, and that one religion he calls the religion of Jesus, which of course is not the church, but the religion of the imagination, of Jesus, the imagination, the perennial wisdom itself. Antiquity taught the religion of Jesus, Blake declares, and in the same sense Blake's contemporary and one-time friend Thomas Taylor the Platonist described the universal theology, of which Platonism is the Western tradition, as coeval with the universe itself. In this sense, it is not religion as such that is in question, but theosophical knowledge, using the word in its wider sense, and not as limited to the Theosophical Society founded by H.P. Blavatsky. Jocelyn Godwin describes the channels in which, from the Renaissance to the 20th century, this esoteric theosophy has flowed, and it was in this current that Yeats placed himself from the time of his first early association with the Theosophical Society as a student in Dublin to his final commitment to Vedanta and his translations of the 10 principal Upanishads in collaboration with his master Sri Purohit Swami. In that tradition he was learned and was himself a part of that theosophical revolution. Both Eliot and Yeats were traditionalists, but it must be understood in different senses of that word. Eliot used the word primarily in a historical sense, using the word history to include the course of ideas and of religious history. We know more than the past, he wrote in his essay on tradition and the individual talent. Yes, and the past is what we know. The whole sequence of the past is changed by the addition made by every present. The idea is an important one, but it is not the concern of Yeats, and the theosophists for whom what is at issue is not history, but the knowledge which is timeless. This tradition has never been the concern of the church or churches. Although there have at all times been certain mystics and mystical theologians, both Catholic and Protestant, rather tolerated than encouraged, Blake and his own masters, Burma and Swedenborg, among them. Yeats was understood neither by Eliot, who was himself dismissive of Yeats's occult studies, nor by the left-wing poets of the modern movement, Auden and his friends. Michael Roberts, compiler of the Faber Book of Modern Verse, and the Marxist critic George Orwell. All these, unable to dismiss Yeats as a poet, scoffed at his esoteric studies, and Auden, in a condescending poem written at the time of Yeats's death, allowed that, although he was silly like us, he is to be excused on account of his writing well. This ignorant and complacent judgment revealed the total failure of Yeats's younger contemporaries to have any conception of Yeats's superior knowledge or of its nature. They thought him old-fashioned because he was indifferent to modern science, used traditional forms, and was not left-wing in his politics. Time is already beginning to show that Yeats's work contributed to a far more fundamental revolution now taking place in the world, the turning of the tide of a materialist civilization. The 3 provincial centuries are over, Yeats wrote in a letter to his friend Sturgeon Moore. Wisdom and poetry return. The prophecies of the great. Himself a student of history from the standpoint of the ancient cosmology of sequence of ages and an alternation of Iron Age dominated by materialist values and Golden Age by spiritual values, himself created his own symbolic diagram of the Gaias and saw the present century not as the dawn of utopia, as did the left-wing poets, but at the terminal phase of Western civilization and the onset of a new dark age, as did Eliot also. But Yeats foresaw an inevitable spiritual revival and return to wisdom and poetry, the values of spiritual knowledge and the perennial philosophy. The Rosicrucian tradition, Kabbalah, the theosophy of Burma, the spiritualist movement, Yeats studied them all, but not all his sources belong to an excluded esoteric knowledge, but are rather to be found in the mainstream of civilization, in the works of Plato and Plotinus, the classical writings of the Sufis, and of course the great central tradition of India, including the Buddhist branch. As an art student in Dublin, he, with his friend the poet-mystic A.E. George Russell, was a member of the Dublin branch of the Theosophical Society, and later in London Yeats met H.P. Blavatsky herself. A.E. remained in lifelong commitment to the Theosophical movement, but Yeats followed the path of magic with the Order of the Golden Dawn, R.R. and A.C., Rosa Rubii et Aurea Crucis, and his wide-ranging studies were all related to discovering that same tradition. He did not exclude Christianity, if understood against a background not of history, but against the background of a mystical understanding, such as the Celtic Church inherited from the Druids. Byzantium is the holy city for Yeats, in which he saw the highest expression of Christendom, and which he himself uses in his poetry as the type and realization of the city of the imagination, flowering in the arts as never before or since in recorded history. India, inevitably, lay at the end, as it did at the beginning of Yeats's quest, as the fullest expression of the civilization of the imagination and the perennial wisdom. a Brahmin teacher, Mohini Chatterjee, had been sent over to Dublin from the London headquarters of the Theosophical Society, commemorated in a poem Yeats wrote long after, specifically for his teaching of the Oriental view of reincarnation, central to Yeats's later studies of the evidence of spiritualism on the soul's continuous and rebirth, a belief shared incidentally by Blake, who was familiar with the Neoplatonic teachings, and specifically with the work loved also by Yeats, Porphyry on the Cave of the Nymphs. Among Yeats's early poems are several on an imagined India of lotuses and peacocks and exotic love. Again, when his friend William Rothenstein, the painter, introduced Yeats to the poems of Rabindranath Tagore, and later to the poet himself, Yeats responded with enthusiasm. In Tagore's work, Yeats saw the realization of his own understanding of what poetry should be. He himself wrote the introduction to Tagore's Gitanjali, 1913, affirming his admiration for work springing from a civilization grounded in spiritual knowledge rather than in material power. A world I have dreamed of all my life long, he wrote. A tradition where poetry and religion are the same thing has passed through the centuries, gathering from learned and unlearned, metaphor and emotion, and carried back again to the multitude the thought of the scholar and the noble. Yeats himself worked on the English versions of several subsequent volumes of Tagore's poems, and the influence of Tagore's translations with Evelyn Underhill of 100 poems of Kabir is to be seen in The Wild Swans at Cool and in subsequent volumes. Yeats's studies scanned the entire horizon of this learning of the imagination by way of the Romantic poets, the Platonic tradition, Arabic literature, his remarkable poems based on the 1001 Nights, the gift of Harun al-Rashid, 1923, following his marriage to George Hythe Lees, is one of his finest. His debt to the No Theatre of Japan is no less profound. In his own plays, The Dreaming of the Bones and Purgatory, his knowledge of the The Dreaming of the Bones and Purgatory, which The Dreaming of the Bones especially is simply a no play. His knowledge of the no, incidentally, he owed to Ezra Pound, who introduced him to the work of Fenollosa. All these are sources which do not lie within the compass of Western academic scholarship and are only slowly coming within the horizon of Western culture. Nevertheless, it is becoming clear that, whereas Eliot rightly situated his own work within the Western tradition of Christendom, Yeats foresaw a future of a more universal culture and a more universal spirituality. Some would say, inevitably, his quest, beginning with theosophy, whose roots are in the Orient, led Yeats full circle to Vedanta. In his last years, he came in full commitment to India's spiritual teachings. With his Indian teacher, Sri Purohit Swami, he made those fine translations of the 10 principal Upanishads, and the Swami had already dedicated to Yeats his own translation of the Bhagavad Gita. Had his declining health allowed him to do so, he had intended to follow the Swami to India, but in spirit he had already reached that fountainhead of spiritual knowledge, whose great river has nourished both the Eastern and the Western worlds since before Socrates to the present day. I have given in barest outline my reasons for seeing Yeats as one of the great seminal minds of this century, and the language of poetry, as he understood it, as a language of an indispensable kind of wisdom. I have not discussed his great poems, these you already know, but have spoken rather of his thought, of those hard symbolic bones under the skin, a theme academic scholars have been reluctant and probably unqualified to discuss. Whereas scientific knowledge is limited to the measurable world and modern critical writings based on history, sociology and politics, Yeats sought in the modern world for all available sources of knowledge of another kind, those immeasurable worlds of meaning, values and truth on which all civilizations before our own have been established, and of which our own is at last becoming aware. It seems that Western civilization has arrived at a point of realization that the material knowledge on which we have prided ourselves is insufficient. Yeats is foremost among those profound minds of our time who has opened for us new worlds, the mental worlds of the imagination, immeasurable and inexhaustible. Thank you. If you have read English literature at any university in this country, whether at Oxford or Cambridge or one of the newer schools, it is not likely that Thomas Taylor, the English pagan, received any mention on the syllabus. If in America, you may well have heard of him as a main influence and source of the transcendentalist movement on Emerson and Bronson Alcott, for whom his translations and commentaries on the works of Plato, Plotinus, and the Neoplatonic writers of the Alexandria school were sacred books. As the first translator of the complete works of Plato, Aristotle, and great parts of Plotinus into English, one might have supposed that the world of classical scholarship owed him thanks. On the contrary, the establishment of his day turned on him in unanimous condemnation, consigning him to oblivion, from which nevertheless he has again and again risen triumphant. For his works have been the treasuries of poets of the imagination, from Blake and Coleridge to W.B. Yeats and George Russell. Some of Taylor's writings were republished by the Theosophical Society at the turn of the century, and at present his complete works are in process of republication by the Prometheus Trust, founded in 1988 with the support of the Platonic Guild, as I've said. The Trust gives as its reason for this ambitious project that Taylor's philosophical understanding of the principles enshrined in the writings of Plato, Proclus, Plotinus, and others is unparalleled in recent times. Taylor was indeed more than a translator. He was himself a profound philosopher. He dedicated his works to the sacred majesty of truth, echoing the words of Plotinus, that there is nothing higher than the truth. Taylor's task, as he saw it, was a restoration of the Platonic theology as the nearest we can come to knowledge absolute. Taylor's understanding of the word Platonism was a broad one. In his essay on the mysteries of Eleusis and Dionysus, he writes, "As to the philosophy by whose assistance these mysteries are developed, it is coeval with the universe itself, and however its continuity may be broken by opposing systems, it will make its appearance at different periods of time, as long as the sun himself shall continue to illuminate the world." This unchanging wisdom has since been called the perennial philosophy, a term first used by the Renaissance scholar Agostino Stucco, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, 1497 to 1548. The notion of a universal wisdom was current among the Renaissance Platonists and was especially associated with Gemistos Plethon, Greek delegate at the Council of Florence in 1438. Thomas Taylor called himself the modern Plethon, and it seems likely that in doing so he was thinking especially of this aspect of Plethon's part in reintroducing the Platonic philosophy into the current of European thought. This perennial wisdom was particularly associated with the Platonic philosophy. That sublime wisdom, according to Taylor, first arose in the colleges of the Egyptian priests, and flourished afterwards in Greece, which was there cultivated by Pythagoras under the mysterious veil of number, by Plato in the graceful dress of poetry, and was systematized by Aristotle as far as it could be reduced to scientific order, which, after becoming in a manner extinct, shone again in its pristine splendor among the philosophers of the Alexandrian school, was learnedly illustrated with Asiatic luxuriancy by Proclus, was divinely explained by Iamblichus, and profoundly delivered in the writings of Plotinus. Indeed, the works of this last philosopher are particularly valuable to all who desire to penetrate into the depths of the divine wisdom. Emerson and the American transcendentalists, who were Taylor's most devoted followers during the 19th century, saw Taylor himself as a link in the golden chain of Platonic successors. Taylor came to philosophy in the way Plato himself advocates, by way of mathematics. At the age of 23, he published a work on the elements of a new method of reasoning in geometry applied to the rectification of the circle. But his challenge to the materialist philosophy was issued when, at the age of 29, he published his paraphrased translation of Plotinus' Ennead 1, Book 6, concerning the beautiful. Excuse me. A moment. Ennead 1, Book 6, concerning the beautiful, which is, by the way, about to be reissued in the facsimile series published by the Wordsworth, Grasmere, Jonathan Wordsworth series, and he's just about to reissue a facsimile edition of Thomas Taylor's Concerning the Beautiful. And so it will be available. It's a very remarkable work in itself, and for his presentation of it, and for its influence, of course, on the Romantic poets, who all seem to have read it. It's time the world read again something concerning the beautiful, which, of course, is scorned and avoided and ridiculed by everyone, really, poets, painters, and of course society as a whole, which is very against the beautiful in all its works. So I hope it will have a new lease of life. The introduction notes to this work are a manifesto, a challenge, certain to be resented by the defenders of the materialist cause, but no less certain to stir the hearts of the poets and all devotees of the imagination. Seldom can a challenge so radical have been issued in the small print of a footnote. Addressing the Platonic part of his readers, Taylor writes, "With respect to true philosophy, you must be sensible that all modern sects are in a state of barbarous ignorance, for materialism with its attendant sensuality have darkened the eyes of the many with the mists of error, and are continually strengthening their corporeal tie. And can anything more effectively dissipate this increasing gloom than the discourses composed by so sublime a genius, pregnant with the most profound conceptions and everywhere full of intellectual light? Can anything so thoroughly destroy the phantom of false enthusiasm as establishing the real object of the true? Let us then boldly enlist ourselves under the banner of Plotinus, and by his assistance vigorously repel the encroachments of error, plunge her dominions into the abyss of forgetfulness, and disperse the darkness of her baneful night. For indeed, there never was a period which required so much philosophic exertion or such vehement contention from the lovers of truth. On all sides, nothing of philosophy remains but the name, and this has become the subject of the vilest prostitution, since it is not only engrossed by the naturalist, chemist, and anatomist, but is usurped by the mechanic in every trifling invention, and made subservient to the lucre of traffic and merchandise. There cannot surely be a greater proof of the degeneracy of the times than so unparalleled a degradation and so barbarous a perversion of the terms. And he concludes with a call to action. Rise up, my friends, and victory will be ours. The foe is indeed numerous, but at the same time feeble, and the weapons of truth in the hands of vigorous union descend with irresistible force and are fatal wherever they fall. Taylor's words have indeed a contemporary ring. To a genius indeed truly modern, with whom the crucible and the air pump are alone the standards of truth, such an attempt must appear ridiculous in the extreme. With these nothing is real but what the hand can grasp or the corporeal eye perceive, and nothing useful but what pampers the appetite or fills the purse. I wish I'd written it myself. In the face of triumphalist science, such a challenge might well seem absurd, but Taylor challenged the supremacy of the authority of Bacon, Newton, and Locke, of what Yeats calls the three provincial centuries, in the name of the philosophic mainstream of European civilization, of Pythagoras and Plato, Plotinus, and the Neoplatonic philosophers who succeeded him. He wrote in an age of revolution, but it is not what revolution destroys, but what knowledge creates and retains that sustains civilization. Far from being a learned recluse, Taylor was from the first embattled, perhaps more than that of any other man of his time. His work marks the beginning of the turning of the tide of materialism. Edgar Vint, author of The Pagan Mysteries of the Renaissance, whose theme is the Platonic revival in 15th century Italy, described him as an integral part of the rise of the soul against mechanism, empiricism, and rationalism, the dynamic impulse of the Romantic movement. Taylor was born in 1758, a year younger than Blake and older than Flaxman. His publications appeared between 1780 to within a year of his death in 1835. His father was a Methodist and hoped his son would become a nonconformist minister. Debarred from Oxford and Cambridge, where only members of the Church of England were admitted, Taylor was intended for Aberdeen University, having received his schooling at St. Paul's School, whose reputation in the teaching of the classics was high, a judgment not shared by the young Platonist, who scorned the entire educational establishment. However, he never went to any university, but instead married for love. Apparently the marriage remained a happy one, whereby the young philosopher cut himself off from the established ways to a career, and the young couple started life in extreme poverty. Taylor first worked as an underpaid schoolmaster, then for 5 years at a bank, from which he was rescued by an appointment as assistant secretary to the Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce, an ironic turn of fate that placed him in the service of a society whose aim was the promotion of these utilitarian sciences Taylor so scorned. As an anti-clerical, Taylor found himself of necessity among many of the liberals and revolutionaries of his time. Mary Wollstonecraft, French translator and editor of Johnson the Left-Wing publisher, whose shop was in St. Paul's Churchyard, was a meeting place for left-wing intellectuals, was at one time his lodger. Mary knew Blake, who illustrated 2 of her books, married Godwin, and was by him the mother of Shelley's wife. Taylor himself, as a Platonist, was a supporter of aristocratic government and the caste system, and in later life seems to have moved away from these wild friends among whom he was thrown in his early years. His translations of Plato were published through the patronage of the liberal, eccentric Charles XI, Duke of Norfolk, whom Taylor must have come to know as president of the Society of the Arts in 1794, and most of these fine volumes lay unsold in the library of Arundel Castle. Nevertheless, it was during the revolutionary and exciting years of the 18th century that Taylor's most significant work was done. A well-known figure of his time, he was an easy and willing target for satire and appears in a novel by the elder Disraeli and as Mr. Mystic in Thomas Love Peacock's novel Melincourt. Taylor gave 12 lectures on the Platonic philosophy in the house of Flaxman, the Platonic theology. It's rather different. On the Platonic theology in the house of Flaxman, and since Blake and Flaxman were close friends and fellow Swedenborgians, it is more than likely that Blake and Taylor met at this time. This I had long surmised from the evidence of Blake's readings of works of Taylor and my identification of the theme of the so-called Arlington Court Tempora as Porphyry's De Antro Nympharum, translated by Taylor. Evidence that at one time the two were friends was published in 1972 by James King in Studies in Romanticism. The evidence lies in a notebook written by William George Meredith, son of George Meredith the architect, 1760 to 1831, and nephew of William George Meredith, who was Thomas Taylor's patron. In his notebook, the younger namesake of William George Meredith recounts anecdotes evidently originating with the older generation, including one which provides clear evidence that Blake and Taylor were at one time on friendly terms. He tells of Blake at Taylor's house, where Taylor was giving him a lesson in mathematics on the fifth proposition of Euclid, which proved that the two angles at the base of an isosceles triangle must be equal. And I quote, Taylor was going through the demonstration, but was interrupted by Blake exclaiming, never mind that. What's the use of going to prove it? Why, I can see it with my eyes that it is so. Unexpectedly enough, it is probably on Blake that Taylor's influence was deepest, both in his use of mythological themes and more fundamentally in confirming Blake's understanding of the Platonic teaching that mental things are alone real. Very unpopular idea at that time. What was at issue in Taylor's writings was nothing less than a reversal of the premises of a civilization, of Western materialism, as it has gradually risen to a virtual, unchallenged orthodoxy of belief. The turn of the century was indeed a time of revolution, but while Republican France sought to instill the goddess reason in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, a change of values more fundamental was coming about, the discovery of the inner universe of imagination. Blake, greatest of the romantic prophets of the imagination as the God within, the divine humanity, the true man, gave eloquence to a vision essentially Platonic, or rather in Taylor's sense, that philosophy coeval with the universe itself. Blake wrote, I rest not from my great task, to open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of man inward into the worlds of thought, into eternity, ever expanding in the bosom of God, the human imagination. In an entry in Public Characters, 1798, it is on record that Taylor, presumably in his late teens, had begun to read Newton's Principles, but he soon closed the book in disgust, exclaiming, "Newton is indeed a great mathematician, but no philosopher." Taylor, in his introduction to Concerning the Beautiful, had already clearly defined the issue which his work, his Herculean labors as a translator and editor of Plato during the next 40 years, was to serve. And this is Taylor. To follow matter through its infinite divisions and wander in its dark labyrinths is the employment of the philosophy in vogue. But surely the energies of intellect are more worthy of our concern than the operations of sense. Where is the microscope which can discern what is smallest in nature? Where the telescope that can see at what point in the universe wisdom first began? Since there is no portion of matter which may not be the subject of experiments without end, let us betake ourselves to the regions of mind, where all things are bounded in intellectual measure, where everything is permanent and beautiful, eternal and divine. Yeats described the English as babes in philosophy and possessing the poorest philosophical literature in Europe. Only the idealist philosopher Berkeley, who himself was deeply influenced by the Hermetica, had presented the argument for the primacy of mind. And the prevailing incomprehension of his work is clear in Dr. Johnson's pronouncement, "Thus I refute him, as he kicked a stone." Unanswerable. But matter is less solid in our time, elusive, as Taylor had described it, a quantum reality that has reduced the atoms of Democritus to intangible fields of force. One may say that matter has become dematerialized. Dr. Johnson could no longer refute Taylor Berkeley by kicking a stone. Taylor quotes a passage from Plotinus from Ennead 6:3, which begins, "Since matter is neither soul, nor intellect, nor life, nor form, nor reason, nor bound, but a certain indefiniteness, nor yet capacity for what can produce. Since it has fallen from all these, it cannot merit the appellation of being, but is deservedly called non-entity, the mere shadow and imagination of bulk, and the desire of subsistence, abiding without station, of itself invisible, and avoiding the desire of him who wishes to perceive its nature. Hence, when one perceives it, it is then in a manner present, but cannot be viewed by him who strives intently to behold it, so that it is a phantom, neither abiding nor yet able to fly away, capable of no one denomination, and possessing no power from intellect, but constituted in the defect and shade, as it were, of all real being. Hence, too, in each of its vanishing appellations it eludes our search, for we think of it as something great, it is in the meantime small. If as something more, it becomes less, and the apparent being which we meet within its image is non-being, and as it were a flying mockery, so that the forms that appear in matter are merely ludicrous shadows, falling upon shadows as in a mirror, where the position of a thing is different from its situation, and which, though apparently full of forms, possesses nothing real and true. But things which enter and depart from matter are nothing but imitations of being and semblances, flowing about a formless semblance. This is really astonishing that Plotinus was able to describe matter in a way that has never been approached until this recent science, of course, does perceive that matter cannot be pinned down as a reality apart from the observing mind. And that is a point of view that was entirely unknown to the materialists at the end of the 18th century. With his usual penetration, Blake follows the argument of Plotinus when he wrote, "Nature has no outline, but imagination has. Nature has no tune, but imagination has. Nature has no supernatural and dissolves. Imagination is eternity." Blake had a wonderful way of getting to the point and summing it up in this unforgettable terms. Indeed, Taylor's influence on Blake deserves a book in itself. With all his visionary insight, it is Taylor's metaphysical exactness of thought that forms the foundation of Blake's luminous aphorisms. Blake's very vocabulary reveals his debt. His mythological figure Enion, matter, is clearly named from Taylor's non-ends. She is an ever-vanishing phantom pursued into her labyrinths. The use of this word is explicable only in terms of Taylor's vocabulary, as used in such passages as this commentary on Bacon. The conceptions of the experimental philosopher who expects to find truth in the labyrinths of matter are not much more elevated than those of the vulgar, for he is ignorant that truth is the most splendid of all things, that she is the constant companion of divinity, and proceeds together with him through the universe. This delusive phantom, however, the man of modern science ardently explores, unconscious that he is running in a fog and darkness and infinite perplexity, and that he is hastening after an object which eludes all detection and mocks all pursuit. Taylor was engaged in his commentaries of Proclus during those years when he knew Blake and his circle, Flaxman, Mary Wollstonecraft, and George Cumberland. If Sipsop the Pythagorean is Blake's light-hearted fantasy, An Island in the Moon is Thomas Taylor, we must conclude that Blake knew Taylor before 1787. It was probably in 1788 that Taylor delivered his 12 lectures on the Platonic theology at Flaxman's house. Taylor's long paper on the restoration of the Platonic theology by the late Platonists appears in the second volume of the Commentaries of Proclus. Blake's tractate, There is no Natural Religion, is dated 1789. It is therefore more than likely that Blake learnt his cogent arguments against Bacon, Newton, and Locke, the natural philosophers, from Taylor. Not in external nature, which for Newton was a great mechanism, to Blake's mind itself is, as for Plato, the ground of reality. As the true method of knowledge is experiment, the true faculty of knowing must be the faculty which experiences. This faculty I treat of. Principle 1, that the poetic genius is the true man, and that the body or outward form of man is derived from the poetic genius. Later Blake used the word imagination for the innate living principle, the true man, called by Plato in Taylor's translation intellect. According to Yeats, the mischief began at the end of the 17th century when man became passive before a mechanized nature. That lasted to our own day, with the exception of a brief period between Smott's Song of David and the death of Byron, wherein imprisoned man beat upon the door. But why should it matter whether we hold nature or the perceiving mind to be the ground? Why should it matter? Do not all men see the same world, whatever view we hold, the same sun and moon, trees and people and houses and the rest? What difference can it make whether we hold the object perceived or the perceiver to be the ultimately real? And yet, this is the source of the profound divergence of two kinds of civilization, Golden Age and Iron Age, that East and West of which Kipling wrote that never the twain shall meet. Western materialism has created the world of technology, which is worldwide. Inventions and powers amazing enough, some useful to life, some destructive, for science in the realm of values is neutral. Indeed, the concept of value simply has no place in the world of science. Yet meanings and values have at all times been the concern of civilization. One might say they are the human kingdom as such, are what makes us human, and in whose absence something dies in us. Is not this inner death the mark of a materialist age? Science deliberately excludes value judgments, making a virtue of objectivity. In their absence, the arts become, as Blake foresaw, formless, and at the bottom of the cup is the nihil of despair. And this cup many of our civilization of material wealth and denial of the spirit have drunk to the dregs. The French metaphysician René Guénon has described modern Western civilization as the reign of quantity, from which reality is attributed only to the measurable. But it is the immeasurable values of spirit, intellect, imagination, life itself, that has at all times been the concern of poets and philosophers. Love and beauty, wisdom and joy. Blake's words, "Everything that lives is holy," take their profound meaning from this context, for the sacred is the supreme experience of value, immeasurable, but in the very nature of life itself. Again, it is Blake who realizes the Platonic vision in that well-known passage in which the materialist questions the man of imagination. What, it will be questioned, when the sun rises, do you not see a round disk of fire, somewhat like a guinea? Oh, no, no, I see an innumerable company of the heavenly host crying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." I question not the corporeal or vegetative eye any more than I would question a window concerning a sight. I look through it and not with it. Again, it was Plato who first used the image of looking through, not with the eye, repeated more than once by Blake. It is the living soul or spirit who sees and experiences. Thus the difference between the two philosophies is nothing less than the difference between life and the absence of life, a living world and a dead world, a mechanism, virtual reality, one might say, hell. Thus it becomes clear why poets, artists, and lovers of wisdom have welcomed Thomas Taylor as a great teacher of the highest wisdom, for the Platonic tradition is nothing less than the great mainstream of the perennial wisdom in European civilization. Taylor's challenge came at a moment when the forces of history were all on the side of materialism, and the Industrial Revolution with its future of technology and all things relating to the material world. All that could be called progress in the creation of wealth and advances in all those useful inventions and discoveries that have made possible the standard of living a great many people now enjoy. Last night we heard Edward Goldsmith discoursing on how progress was responsible for almost every ill in our world. And the very word it negates itself. At the same time, the Romantic movement in poetry and the other arts in England and Germany, and in France a great stirring in esoteric studies, was nothing less than a spiritual renaissance. The prophetic voice of William Blake is heard to this day, and the poetry of Coleridge, Shelley, Keats, and Wordsworth continue to speak to the soul of England and beyond. Are poets, after all, the unacknowledged legislators of the world? The prophetic voice had not been silenced. However, those whom Taylor called the foe were not slow to answer his challenge, as he must have expected, perhaps hoped, for the battle in which he had engaged himself is age-old and fought in every generation, that civilization may not sink the great battle lost, Yeats wrote. The works of Taylor, republished by the Theosophical Society, were in Yeats's library. And Mrs. Yeats told me that it was she who brought them there. So that's a word for Mrs. Yeats, well deserved. She too was a student of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, of course. The Encyclopedia Britannica, 11th edition, puts it on record that Taylor's efforts were unfavorably, even contemptuously received. Admittedly, had Taylor written in a less formidable English, his translations might have been more widely read. Yeats called his style atrocious, and Coleridge, who, as a precocious schoolboy, had included the works of Taylor among his darling studies, wrote that Taylor had translated Proclus from difficult Greek into incomprehensible English. He does not, like McKenna, make Plotinus a delight to read. He even, which might seem equally difficult, makes Apuleius boring, but he does compel attention to the subtleties of ideas. It is on record that he used to say that he had learned Greek rather through Greek philosophy than Greek philosophy through Greek. He was a philosopher rather than a linguist, and his purpose was to make known the Platonic teachings. He himself wrote that, in perusing the works of these great men, the reader must not expect to find the sublimest truths explained in a familiar manner and adapted, like many modern publications, to the meanest of capacities, to what would nowadays be called a wider audience. We hear the phrase every day. So Taylor had no great desire for a wider audience. Since Taylor had not been to a university and was in that sense self-taught, it was easy to attack him for his imperfect knowledge of the Greek language. His young friend Thomas Love Peacock has put it on record that he was a mortal foe to Greek accents, treating them with a righteous scorn. This opinion laid him open to the charge of avoiding accents through ignorance. This was certainly not the true reason why he hated them. It was, however, too telling a point for popular writers to neglect. However, the real reason why Taylor was over and over again consigned to oblivion had little to do with Greek breathings. He was challenging received opinion, and that on two fronts. The universities were in the hands of Anglican clergy who were not likely to welcome a restoration of the Platonic theology by a self-taught trespasser in their field who professed polytheism. Taylor treated Christian theology and the natural sciences with equal scorn. The Edinburgh Review of April 1809 announced that the hand of oblivion has passed over him, and what follows reveals very clearly that the attack is in reality a violent rejection of Neoplatonism and those aspects of Plato himself at variance with the theology of the Lowland Scots. Taylor is accused of exhibiting Plato as the mortal foe both of reason and of taste, those enthroned values of the Enlightenment. He has not translated Plato, he has travestied him in the most cruel and abominable manner. He has not elucidated, but covered him over with impenetrable darkness. How so? By adding by way of notes Proclus commentaries. In the character of commentator, Mr. Taylor has scarcely done anything, or indeed proposed to do anything, but to fasten upon Plato the reveries of Proclus and of other philosophers of the Alexandrian school. And finally, how can any reader follow Plotinus without disgust? Here the ghost of John Knox rises to denounce witchcraft and superstitions. Proclus and his school were, without exception, impostors and mountebanks, thaumaturges par métier. The names of the current pillars of reason and good taste, Jacob Bryant, Cicero, Horace, and Gibbon, are invoked as witnesses against the wild, mystical, and obscure writings of Proclus and Plotinus, the solemn trifling and impenetrable obscurity of these sages who profess to reveal the system of the universe. To sum up, Taylor was an ass in the first place. Secondly, he knows nothing of the religion of which he is so great a fool as to profess himself a votary. And thirdly, he knew less than nothing of the language about which he is continually writing. So there you have it. Some of you who have noticed the reviews of, for example, Sir Lawrence Vanderpost in the popular press will Dr. Gillies, in which the unfaithfulness of that excellent Grecian's translation of the Ethics of Aristotle is inferred from the want of that creeping verbal accuracy which distinguishes his own. Let us give Dr. Gillies a hearing. The nature and scope of my literary labours are so totally different from those of Mr. Taylor that it is not easy to understand how our paths could cross. Utility, common and vulgar utility, above which that sublime author so proudly soars, was my great, or rather my sole aim. What word could be more calculated to appear to the common man of the first decade of the 19th century than utility? The Edinburgh Review and other journals of the day knew that they could flatter the complacency of ignorance by making their appeal to received opinion. The same is true of every generation of journalists. But so eminent a man of letters as Horace Walpole had less need to disguise his and their real object of hostility, Plato himself. And this is Walpole. Taylor's book was shown to me this summer by one of those wiseacres who call themselves learned men, who told me it was tremendous. I was neither alarmed nor curious, yet, on your ladyship's notice, I borrowed the monthly review and find that the world's future religion is to be founded on a blundered translation of an almost unintelligible commentator on Plato. So much for Proclus. I guess, however, that the religion this new apostle recommends is not a belief in the pantheon of the pagan divinities, but the creed of the philosophers, who really did not believe in their idols, but whose metaphysics were frequently as absurd, and yet this half-witted Taylor prefers them to Bacon and Locke, who were almost the first philosophers who introduced common sense into their writings, and were as clear as Plato was unintelligible, because he did not understand himself. So much for Plato. The Romantic poets received the Neoplatonic teachings with delight, equal to the hostility they aroused in the man of the materialist majority. Coleridge, by way of contrast with the Edinburgh Review, Walpole and the rest, wrote this of Proclus: "The most beautiful and orderly development of this philosophy, which endeavours to explain all things by an analysis of consciousness, and builds up a world in the mind out of the materials furnished by the mind itself, is to be found in the Platonic theology of Proclus." He went so far as to make Proclus the touchstone of a capacity for metaphysics. "Let a prepared scholar," so he wrote in the margin of Taylor's Proclus, "attentively peruse chapter 6, book 1, concerning the essence of mathematical genera and species, if possible in the original Greek, and the result in his mind will inform him whether nature has intended him for metaphysical research. If I have any conception of sublimity arising from a majestic vision of tranquil truth, it will be found in this chapter." What to Coleridge was beautiful and orderly was to Walpole nonsense, and for the Edinburgh Review impenetrable darkness. When we really read that a philosopher is unintelligible, may we not ask, to whom? The clue to Coleridge's love of Proclus is already given in an autobiographical passage in a letter written in 1796. As a precocious schoolboy, he had already discovered what was to be the direction of his life: metaphysics and poetry and facts of mind, i.e., the accounts of all the strange phantasms that ever possessed your philosophy dreamers, from Thoth the Egyptian, Coleridge is referring to the Hermetica, to Taylor the English pagan, are my darling studies. Livingston Lowes, in that delightful book, The Road to Xanadu, on the sources of Coleridge's imagery in Kubla Khan, is without comprehension of the nature of this mode of thought, and to Lowes, Neoplatonism, one of the strangest tendencies which marked the tumultuous exit of the century, one of the curious beads on Coleridge's string, rather than the string upon which the beads are strung. Robert Blakey, in his History of the Philosophy of Mind, 1888, gives a generous account of Taylor. Mr. Taylor conceives that all which the moderns possess of moral science consists of nothing else than small and broken, though splendid, fragments of the great Platonic union of the universe, He therefore, with a contempt which appears narrow and somewhat arrogant, rejects acceptance of and declines all attention to the dark and partial systems of modern writers, not, however, out of a deficiency of powers of judging of them, but from a conceived previous fullness and redundancy of loftier and better knowledge. It was inevitable that Taylor should scorn Christian theology as he found it in his time and place, but to do so required a degree of courage or knowledge possessed by few. Coleridge himself retreated into orthodoxy and called Taylor a blind bigot for his objections to Bacon, adding that the modern chemists talk of Bacon. Had Taylor and Blake discussed Bacon, for Blake, with an assurance equal to Taylor's, declared that Bacon's philosophy has ruined England. Shelley's so-called atheism was in reality Platonism. He had no need of translation in order to read the Greek, but nevertheless Taylor had created an intellectual climate in which Shelley's use of Greek myths and themes and his rebellion against Christianity had a context. Through his friendship with Thomas Love Peacock, Shelley must have been well aware of Taylor's subversive ideas and might well have met him. Keats's indebtedness to the Greek revival through the sculptures of the Parthenon frieze brought to England through Lord Elgin is well known, as is Flaxman's enthusiasm for the Portland vase, the Barberini funeral urn brought to England by Sir William Hamilton. Flaxman's enthusiasm was responsible for the Wedgwood replicas, and Erasmus Darwin, friend of the Wedgwoods, included an article in his work, The Botanic Garden, in which it is argued that the figures on the vase are representations of the Eleusinian mysteries. The vase itself must have been for a time in Blake's studio, for Blake was the engraver of the illustrations included in Darwin's poem. It was Taylor's work on the mysteries of Eleusis and Dionysus that made these known in their full symbolic richness of meaning. It is beyond doubt that Keats's beauty is truth, truth beauty, follows Plotinus' argument in the tractate published by Taylor that the beautiful and the good are the same. Even Wordsworth echoes the Platonic revival when he affirms in his most famous ode on the pre-existence of souls. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath elsewhere had its setting, and cometh from afar, not in entire forgetfulness. This is pure Platonism, for rebirth is contrary to the teachings of Christian theology. Blake's Arlington Court tempera painting is an illustration of Porphyry's work, translated by Taylor, on the Homeric cave of the nymphs. The theme of Porphyry's work and of Blake's painting is the descent and return of souls in the cycle of rebirth. Blake's young friends, the Shoreham ancients, so named themselves in distinction from the moderns, and Samuel Palmer described himself as a Platonist. In a letter written from Pompeii to his sister-in-law in 1838, he recalls evenings spent in reading what can only have been Taylor's translation of Plato. Blessed also will be the mind informed with Plato. Would that mine were so. The very antithesis of the literary impudence, dandyism, and materialism with which most of the modern periodicals tend imperceptibly to imbue the mind. If ever I am to open a book again and not to live a fool and die a brute, may I open once more the divine pages of Plato in some happy Grove Street evening with you and dear Annie, his wife, by my fireside. But it is too good to be hoped for in this world, except with Euripides in his cave, too deep to hear the rumble of her rubbish carts. Well, how is the time going? Because I think I'll have to cut a little bit.
8 o'clock.
What?
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock. Well, I think I'll cut out what I put in about the American transcendentalists, who, of course, were they valued the writings of Taylor, took them to America. They were in the Library of Fruitlands. They were the foundation of Emerson's work on the first country which really understood that all religions are one and that all are versions of this one sublime truth, was Emerson, and of course Bronson Alcott. And there was a journal published for 8 years called by Thomas Johnson, I think he was, entitled The Platonist, which published a great deal of Taylor's work. And it really got into America long before it got into England. And of course, the same thing is happening at the present time, I'm afraid. While 19th century England was devoting its best energies to the Industrial Revolution, in New England the seeds of Platonism fell on more fertile soil. Oh, that is still more about the transcendentalists. Oh, well, I think I can read that bit. It's not too long. I hope you're not bored. They fell on more fertile soil. The transcendentalist movement, in and through the works above all of Emerson and Bronson Alcott, eclectic as it was, took as its foundation the Platonic philosophy as expounded by Taylor. Emerson was reading Taylor as early as 1826, when he was 23, and continued to do so throughout the next decade, at the time in which he was organizing the thought that was to culminate in his Nature, 1836, the Bible of Transcendentalism. Emerson describes Transcendentalism as a spiritual philosophy, idealist and basically Platonic. It was the Transcendentalists who first realized Blake's understanding that all religions are one. Emerson and Alcott both brought back from visits to England as many of Taylor's works as they could find, the Library of Fruitlands, seat of their new Eden. Taylor's Select Works of Plotinus was a volume cherished by Emerson, for many years kept within easy reach of his writing table, and which he marked and indexed as a favorite possession. He saw Taylor as above all a man of imagination, and wrote of him, "There are also prose poets." Thomas Taylor, the Platonist, for instance, is really a better man of imagination, a better poet, or perhaps I should say a better feeder to a poet, than any man between Milton and Wordsworth. And of Plotinus he wrote, "Wonderful seemed to me as I read Plotinus the calm and grand air of these few cherubs, great spiritual lords who have walked the world, they of the old religion, dwelling in a worship that makes the sanctities of Christianity parvenu and merely popular." Inspired by Emerson and Alcott, Thomas M. Johnson for 8 years edited The Platonist, a journal devoted chiefly to the dissemination of the Platonic philosophy in all its phases. At the time when the tide of Platonism was ebbing in America, Taylor began to be rediscovered in England by the Theosophical Society, notably by G.R.S. Mead, translator of the Hermetica, Thrice Greatest Hermes, 1906, Fragments of a Faith Forgotten, Gnostic Writings. Mead, like Taylor, understood scholarship not as an end, but as a means to making available precious knowledge. His Orpheus, the Theosophy of the Greeks, published by the Theosophical Society, is largely based on Taylor's introduction to the mystical hymns of Orpheus. In his foreword to the Theosophical Society's edition of Taylor's Select Works of Plotinus, 1896, Mead paid him tribute. It is true that the perfected scholarship of our own time demands a higher standard of translation than Taylor presents, but what is true of his critics then is true of his critics today. Though they may know more Greek, he knew more Plato. Taylor was more than a scholar, he was a philosopher in the Platonic sense of the word. The Irish Renaissance was itself rooted in the theosophical movement, especially through A.E., George Russell, the poet and mystic. A.E. compared the Irish literary movement to the Transcendentalist movement in America. Yeats himself was for a time a member of the Theosophical Society, and Mead's books were in his library, including his edition of Taylor's Plotinus. Stephen McKenna gave the Irish literary movement his beautiful translation of the Enneads of Plotinus. There was no longer the same need for Taylor's translations as earlier in the century, but he was nevertheless honored, and A.E. called him the uncrowned king. With the Theosophical Society came the first great influx of Oriental philosophy, above all from India. Yeats, who in the course of his life scanned the entire horizon of sacred knowledge then available in the world. In Yeats, there shouldn't be a who in that sentence. From the No Theatre of Japan to Sufi and Arabic sources and the oral tradition of Western Ireland. As a member of the Magical Society of the Golden Dawn, he studied mainly the Western esoteric tradition based in Rosicrucianism and Kabbalah. Near the end of his life, he returned full circle to India, and with his teacher Sri Purohit Swami made his beautiful translations of the 10 principal Upanishads. Purohit Swami's translation of the Bhagavad Gita is dedicated to Yeats. Taylor had done his work and prepared the way for the Platonic river which had fertilized Europe for more than 2,000 years to become a tributary to the great mainstream of Indian philosophy. The men of the New Age in this century look not to Platonism but to India for enlightenment, whether through the Vedic tradition itself or through Buddhism, which is itself a product of that mainstream. Sanskrit, not Greek, is likely to be seen as the sacred language of the future, the key to spiritual wisdom. Taylor himself would surely have acquiesced in this merging of the Platonic tributary into the great sacred river of India. But Taylor remains the principal source in England of that rise of soul against intellect now beginning in the world, of which Yeats saw himself a part. Yeats venerated Plotinus no less than did Taylor himself, and above poetry he held spiritual wisdom when he wrote, "For it is time to bid the muse go pack, choose Plato and Plotinus for a friend." And I will end with Yeats's poem, The Delphic Oracle upon Plotinus. Behold that great Plotinus swim, buffeted by such seas. Bland Rhadamanthus beckons him, but the golden race looks dim, salt blood blocks his eyes. Scattered on the level grass or winding through the grove, Plato there and Minos pass, there stately Pythagoras, and all the choir of love. Inspiration is really what his poetry is most concerned with. It must be said that inspiration is a word that has no meaning in terms of current materialist premises that assume the quantifiable material universe to comprise the whole of reality. Memory, for example, is held to be the recall of past events imprinted in some manner on the brain cells that has taken place in the world of time and space. But Plato's myth that calls the muses, the inspirers, the daughters of memory, does not mean that our knowledge comes to us through experience of the physical world. Plato meant much more. He held that the soul has access to knowledge of another kind, universal or cosmic knowledge. Memory in the Platonic sense is a process of recollection, anamnesis, unforgetting. Inspiration is, within this context, a process of recollection. In this sense, the Greek muses are the inspirers of all the arts, and each muse of a specific art. Traditionally they are 9 in number: Clio, the muse of history; Euterpe of flute music; Thalia of comedy; Melpomene of tragedy; Terpsichore of lyric poetry and the dance; Erato of love poetry; Polyhymnia of heroic hymns; Urania of astrology; Calliope of epic poetry. They belong to the retinue of Apollo, god of inspiration, whose gifts they diversify. Plato in the Ion tells of the garden of the muses, whence poets draw their inspiration according to their different gifts. The muses have remained in the parlance of poets, doubtless because the inspirers have remained a reality to all poets of the imagination. Yeats speaks of his instructors who tell him, "We have come to bring you images for poetry." As to the experience of inspiration, it is a state of mind in which the poet has access to knowledge and creative power not normally accessible. He is at such times possessed, as it were, by another mind, a divine inspirer, who empowers him with a clearer, greater understanding than what Plato calls the sober mind, a kind of intoxication whose symbol in Islamic poetry is wine, and indeed Dionysus or Bacchus is the Greek inspirer of this kind of intoxicated inspiration. Apollo is a more orderly god. It is Bacchus, Dionysus, who is this rhapsodic inspirer. And in Islamic poetry, the symbol is wine. And in this ecstatic state, this divine intoxication, the poet possesses, or is possessed by, a greater knowledge than that of the common daily mind, together with control of an ordering principle, rhythmic, as is music or dance, which seems to come from a higher source, whether from within the mind or from beyond the individual mind. Beyond, in either case, the common daily mind with its limited knowledge and limited powers. However explained, inspiration is a reality known to all poets of the imagination, and in whose absence no great poetry can be written. Am I speaking loud enough? Can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
You can. Thank you. Blake's account of his great painting, A Vision of the Last Judgment, contains the fullest and clearest account of the nature of inspiration known to me, certainly the fullest by any English poet. Blake makes Plato his starting point, and although he finds in Plato matter of disagreement, he himself is only extending Plato's teaching. And this is Blake. The Last Judgment is not fable or allegory, but vision. Fable or allegory are a totally distinct and inferior kind of poetry. Vision or imagination is a representation of what eternally exists, really and unchangeably. Fable or allegory is formed by the daughters of memory. Imagination is surrounded by the daughters of inspiration. When Blake writes, imagination has nothing to do with memory, he is affirming the creative power of imagination itself, which does not depend on events of past personal or collective experience of outer events in times and places of this world. Here he is misrepresenting, surely, Plato, whose mnemosyne is a recollection of things eternal in the mind. But Blake's distinction does illustrate an essential point, that the muses are daughters of inspiration, and their garden not to be found in this world. What those eternal things displayed by the daughters of inspiration may be is not possible to define, but what it is not, Blake clearly tells us. Eternal identity is one thing, and corporeal vegetation is another thing. Blake's daughters of inspiration are in the aggregate called Jerusalem, who is, following the book of Revelation, the bride of Christ. In Blake's term, Jesus is the imagination and Jerusalem the soul, bride of the imagination. Plato also holds the archetypal order to be prior to the world of the soul. Plato calls intellect the true man, whereas for Blake, imagination is the true man. Imagination is the human existence itself, and thus, in Blake's terms, the divine humanity. And I quote, "This world of imagination is the world of eternity. It is the divine bosom into which we shall all go after the death of the vegetated body. This world of imagination is infinite and eternal, whereas the world of generation or vegetation is finite and temporal. There exists in that eternal world the permanent realities of everything which we see reflected in this vegetable glass of nature. All things are comprehended in their eternal forms in the divine body of the Saviour, the true vine of eternity, the human imagination." Here Blake is at once following Plato and going beyond him. It is Plato who describes time as a moving image of eternity, but Plato's eternal world is not explicitly located, as for Blake, within man himself, as the divine humanity, the divine bosom, Jesus, the imagination. Plato too held man to be immortal, and that at death we return to the eternal world whence we came. But for Blake, imagination is already in this life accessible at all times, here and now, in every present, the source of inspiration whenever we raise our minds to those inner regions. The mortal senses do not give knowledge, only information, and Blake concludes his account of a vision of the Last Judgment with the words, "I question not my corporeal or vegetable eye, any more than I would question a window concerning a sight. I look through it, and not with it." The image of looking through, not with the eye, is itself taken from Plato. Blake, however, concedes that fable or allegory is seldom without some vision. Pilgrim's Progress is full of it, the Greek poets the same, but allegory and vision ought to be known as two distinct things, and so called for the sake of eternal life. Eternal life, for though on earth things seem permanent, they are less permanent than a shadow, as we all know too well. Without Plato, Blake could not have written on the Daughters of Inspiration. He had read Plato in the translations of Thomas Taylor, the Platonist, whom he had known at one time, and whose works influenced him deeply throughout his life, from the early Songs of Experience to one of his latest paintings, the Arlington Court Tempera, which is an illustration of the Neoplatonic Porphyry's work on the Cave of the Nymphs. However, Blake makes one perhaps just criticism of Plato in his account of a vision of the Last Judgment. Plato has made Socrates say that poets and prophets do not know or understand what they write or utter. This is a most pernicious falsehood. If they do not, praise is an inferior kind to be called knowing. Plato confutes himself. Plato in the Ion does indeed say that poets could not compose their poems when in their sober minds, and the theme of poetic intoxication recurs again and again, from the Sufi poets to Keats and W.B. Yeats, Blake's first editor and greatest devotee. Yeats, in All Souls' Night, places on his table 2 long glasses brimmed with muscatel in his ceremonious summoning of the ghosts of dead friends. Because I have a marvelous thing to say, a certain marvelous thing none but the living mock, though not for sober ear. Blake too held that in a state of inspiration the poet knows more, not less, than when in his sober mind. He understands inspiration as a state of expanded consciousness in which the finite individual enters the universal mind of the imagination. And I quote, "Then those in great eternity met in the council of God." I'll try again. "Then those in great eternity met in the council of God as one man. For contracting their exalted senses, they behold multitude, or expanding, behold as one. As one man, all the universal family, and that one man they call Jesus the Christ, and they in him, and he in them, live in perfect harmony in Eden, the land of life, consulting as one man above the mountain of Snowdon sublime." All spiritual traditions recognize 4 levels or worlds: Platonic, Vedic, Kabbalist, Buddhist, and the 4 appear to belong to the nature of things in the mental worlds. Blake, who takes his term from Swedenborg, himself describes these 4 worlds, of which Eden, the land of life, is the highest. "Now I a 4-fold vision see, and a 4-fold vision is given to me, 4-fold in my supreme delight, and 3-fold in soft Beulah's night, and 2-fold always. May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." Single vision and Newton's sleep perfectly describe the materialist mentality which in our own society lays claim to representing the total sum of knowledge, a claim supported, it is said, by natural science. This claim Blake calls sleep, since it precludes the expanded consciousness which he himself and all spiritual traditions acknowledge. Albion, the collective being of the English nation, Blake declares repeatedly, is sunk in deadly sleep, and his prophetic message to his nation is not to repent, but to awake to ever-present realities of imagination. To Plato and all other mystical traditions, the higher worlds are causal in relation to the lower, and the world of matter the effect of higher causes, a teaching evolutionary scientific theory has reversed, making mind and spirit a product of material causes, a view Blake denies when he writes, "Every natural effect has a spiritual cause and not a natural cause only seems." Eden is called the land of life because life itself is the originator. Beulah is the world of soul or love, psyche, since Beulah is a biblical symbol for the married state. Nature itself is 2-fold because a living world, not a lifeless mechanism as Newton conceived the universe. This lifeless world Blake calls Ulro, a world outside existence, which is the true metaphysical hell. For Blake, Milton was the supreme poet of inspiration. His prophetic poem entitled Milton is on the theme of inspiration, and Milton is in this poem described as the inspired man. Milton was at the same time, according to Blake, less than true to his own imagination, and in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, 1790, Blake puts his case against Milton, which was to be the theme of the prophetic book entitled Milton, 1804 to 1808. Besides the Bible, Milton was from the outset probably the most important influence on Blake. Milton was England's supreme mythological poet, and Blake was in this respect his only successor before Coleridge and Shelley. Milton, of course, sees heaven and hell in the accepted Christian terms of irreconcilable states of good and evil, and Blake in the Tyger already asks the question, did he who made the lamb make thee? No answer is given, but who can read these two poems of contrary states and not recognize the tiger as a glorious beast, while the lamb, who is called by his name, is insipid in comparison? The answer Blake does not give in the Tyger is stated plainly in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and that marriage may be seen as the central theme of all Blake's subsequent work. Blake is calling in question not only Milton, but his other great influential master, Swedenborg, and indeed the Christian church as such. Blake's discernment that there is a princer higher than either good or evil, that neither the just nor the wicked are in the supreme state, is his great contribution. Good and evil are contraries, without which there is no progression. They are necessary to human existence, which possesses wholeness only within the higher principle of imagination. An eternal hell and an eternal heaven have from the first been a part of Christian mythology. Dante's Divine Comedy is based on this orthodox Catholic theology, no less than is Milton's Protestant epic. Blake's last work, unfinished at the time of his death, was his splendid series of illustrations to Dante, of whom he wrote, "Dante saw devils where I saw none." One of the earlier plates of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell illustrates Dante's canto on Ugolino and his sons in prison, and in another version, Blake illustrates the same theme, but with the addition of two angels bending over the sufferers with sheltering wings. It seems strange that eternal hell remains so long an unquestioned article of Christian faith. The Buddhist cosmology also includes hells, but these are not eternal, and Blake too understood that it is necessary to distinguish between individuals and the states through which men travel. In his account of the vision of the Last Judgment, in which all these quotations virtually are, he writes, "Man passes on, but states remain forever. He passes through them like a traveler, who may as well suppose that the places he has passed through exist no more, as a man may suppose that the states he has passed through exist no more. Everything is eternal." Satan is a state, but imagination is not a state. It is the human existence itself. Spirituality, Blake understood, has nothing to do with judgmental morality and everything to do with the imagination. In The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake has found his radical solution to the traditional Christian confrontation of good and evil. These are replaced by the contraries of reason and energy, as he states in his manifesto. Without contraries is no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. There follows an argument spoken in The Voice of the Devil. All Bibles or sacred codes have been the causes of the following errors. 1. That man has two real existing principles, viz. A body and a soul. 2. That energy called evil is alone from the body, and that reason called good is alone from the soul. 3. That God will torment man in eternity for following his energies. But the following contraries to these are true. 1. Man has no body distinct from his soul, for that called body is a portion of soul, discerned by the 5 senses, the chief inlets of soul in this age. 2. Energy is the only life and is from the body, and reason is the bound or outward circumference of energy. 3. Energy is eternal delight. The marriage of heaven and hell, part aphorism, part satire, is directed in particular against Swedenborg, whose work Heaven and Hell Blake had read about 1790. 2 other works of Swedenborg he had read at about the same time: The Wisdom of Angels Concerning Divine Love and Divine Wisdom, and The Wisdom of Angels Concerning Divine Providence. The marriage of heaven and hell is thought to have been etched between 1790 and 93, while Swedenborg was fresh in his mind. It is likely that Blake's family were Swedenborgians, and it is on the record that Blake and his wife, and Blake's friend Flaxman and his wife, were early signatories of the Swedenborgian Society's manifesto in the year 1789. Blake was a lifelong admirer of Swedenborg, and his much-discussed system is essentially that of Swedenborg, whom he praised to the diarist Crabbe Robinson during his last years. At the same time, he differed from Swedenborg in one important essential. Swedenborg follows the received Christian teaching that good and evil, heaven and hell, are forever separate, and Blake's criticism of his admired teacher is to the point. He writes, "I have always found that angels have the vanity to speak of themselves as the only wise. This they do with a confident insolence sprouting from systematic reasoning. Thus, Swedenborg boasts that what he writes is new, though it is only the contents or index of already published books. Now hear a plain fact. Swedenborg has not written one new truth. Now hear another. He has written all the old falsehoods." Blake extended this criticism of Swedenborg in the poem Milton. The old falsehood for which he specially blamed his admired master is precisely his judgmental morality. Of all the sins, Blake most detested self-righteousness and the cruel virtues of the natural heart. And he writes, "O Swedenborg, strongest of men, the Samson shorn by the churches, showing the transgressors in hell, the proud warriors in heaven, heaven as a punisher, hell as one under punishment." Blake knew that he himself had understood one new truth, the truth of imagination, which is above the contraries. The other great work on the theme of heaven and hell is, of course, Paradise Lost, and the marriage of heaven and hell, in the marriage of heaven and hell, Blake, having stated his new truth, comes at once to Milton. Having declared that energy is eternal delight, he continues, "Those who restrain desire do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained, and the restrainer reason usurps its place and governs the unwilling. And being restrained, it by degrees becomes passive, till it is only the shadow of desire." The history of this is written in Paradise Lost, and the governor or reason is called Messiah, and the original archangel or possessor of the command of the heavenly host is called the devil or Satan, and his children are called sin and death. But in the book of Job, Milton's Messiah is called Satan, for this history has been adopted by both parties. It indeed appeared to reason as if desire was cast out, but the devil's account is that the Messiah fell and formed a heaven of what he stole from the abyss. This is shown in the Gospel, where he prays to the Father to send the Comforter, or desire, that reason may have ideas to build on, the Jehovah of the Bible being no other than the devil, he who dwells in flaming fire. Know that after Christ's death he became Jehovah, but in Milton the Father is destiny, the Son a ratio of the five senses, and the Holy Ghost a vacuum. And here Blake expresses what many have felt about Milton's poem. Note, the reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. Blake's series of 22 engravings of the Book of Job is the last of his series on the primacy of the imagination. In that work, Blake takes Job's error to be self-righteousness, pleading his righteousness and denying all the arguments of his friends that since he is suffering he must at some time have broken some law. The central figure in Blake's reading of the book is Elihu, who speaks not by the book, but from the imagination. Elihu has remained silent from deference to the age and experience of Job's friends. And he says, days should speak, and multitude of years teach wisdom. But there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth him understanding. Elihu claims to speak on God's behalf, to bring his knowledge from afar, that he who is perfect in knowledge is with thee. God is not a moralist, but a mystery, who is nevertheless present, and is that spirit in man, wiser than experience. I have written elsewhere on the theme of Blake's Job illustrations, which are his last word on the redemptive power of imagination from the reasoner, who is also the accuser, whose 10 commandments Blake challenged. Imagination is the spirit in man, who is the inspiration of the Almighty. The marriage of heaven and hell ends with the words of the devil, who declared that Jesus broke all the 10 commandments, and concludes, I tell you, no virtue can exist without breaking these 10 commandments. Jesus was all virtue and acted from impulse, not from rules. The argument against Milton outlined in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake extended into the mythological prophetic poem Milton, written some 15 years later, between 1804 and 1808. Milton's legalistic morality notwithstanding, Blake took him as the type of the inspired man, and indeed Milton opens Paradise Lost with an invocation of his heavenly muse. He uses the Greek word, but rather ostentatiously gives her a biblical context, not a classical one. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed. Or if Zion's hill delight thee more, and Silo's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid. The revelation of God through Moses came while the Israelites were living on Mount Horeb. The 10 commandments were delivered on Sinai, and Zion is the holy hill of Israel, where David the poet king founded his city. Having in this way at once invoked the muse and dissociated himself from the classical tradition, Milton goes on to invoke the Holy Spirit, the God within, which would have pleased Blake. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowest, thou from the first wast present.
The Holy Spirit is timeless and omniscient, a theme taken up again in Paradise Regained, where Jesus claims the same omniscience. Tempted by Satan to study the works of the philosophers, Jesus, like Elihu refuting the wisdom of experience in the book of Job, rejects learning in the name of inspiration. Think not but that I know these things, or think I know them not. Not therefore am I short of knowing what I ought. He who receives light from above, from the fountain of light, no other doctrine needs, though granted true. Blake's divine humanity is not the historical Jesus, but the universal Christ, Jesus the imagination. The name and conception is taken from Swedenborg, whose grand man of the heavens is the collective being of all humankind. The passage already cited about the one man derives ultimately from the Jewish mystical tradition of Adam Kadmon. It has recently been discovered that Swedenborg was on close terms with members of a millenarist Jewish community in London, and that is clearly where Blake got the idea of the divine human who is one in many and many in one. It goes straight back to this traditional source through Swedenborg. I didn't discover that when I was writing my book on Blake, and I much regret it, but I'm glad that someone else has done so. So Blake's poem Milton opens with an invocation of the Muse that deliberately recalls Milton's opening invocation to Paradise Lost, but with differences. This is Blake. Daughters of Beulah, muses who inspire the poet's song, come into my hand by your mild power, descending down the nerves of my right arm from out the portals of my brain, where by your ministry the eternal great humanity divine planted his paradise, and in it caused the spectres of the dead to take sweet forms in likeness of himself. This is a long way from Milton, who, although he invokes the inner light of the Holy Spirit, sees Adam as essentially a fallen being, a creature made by God, but very far from Blake's understanding of imagination as the human eternal being in every man, the all in man. Man is all imagination. God is man and exists in us and we in him. In an annotation to Berkeley's Cyrus, in which Berkeley says that Plato and Aristotle considered God as abstracted and distinct from the natural world, but the Egyptians considered God and nature as making one whole, Blake comments, they also considered God as abstract or distinct from the imaginative world, but Jesus, as also Abraham and David, considered God as man in the spiritual or imaginative vision. Jesus considered imagination to be the real man. In a letter to William Haley in 1803, Blake expressed a thought very critical of the kind of guilt-ridden Christianity that sees man as a fallen creature. Haley was Blake's patron. He was a well-known poet of the time. He didn't understand Blake at all. Some say that happiness is not good for mortals, but they ought to be answered that sorrow is not fit for immortals and is utterly useless to anyone. Blake's absolute affirmation of the divinity of the imagination, Jesus is God, is an insight that brings him close to the Vedic understanding of the divine self in all created beings and in man, known as Satchitananda, being, consciousness, bliss. Blake also understood that bliss belongs to the very nature of being and consciousness, to the imagination, inseparable from them and from life itself. And Blake uses the words bliss and delight, which are no part of the Christian view of a fallen humanity in a fallen world. Blake understood that energy is eternal delight, and wrote, "Arise, you little glancing wings, and drink your bliss, for everything that lives is holy." Such a thought in relation to the created world is very far from the Christian religion, but very much part of the Vedic tradition. In order to understand the mythological narrative with which Milton opens, Milton's name does not appear before Plate 14, we must go back to the argument outlined in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Milton, as we have seen, invoked his heavenly muse from Horeb, Sinai, and Zion, thus declaring his adherence to the Protestant cause. Blake's muses are the daughters of Beulah, the world of mild, moony luster in soft sexual delusions of varied beauty. Blake knew, as did Dante, that the erotic opens the doors of the imagination. It was Dante to whom, in a dream, love said, "Ego dominus tuus," I am your lord. Blake, in his poem, summons Milton back after 100 years to redeem his feminine emanations, his 3 wives and 3 daughters, and to submit himself to the divine human, the imagination. There follows an account of the binding of Urizen, the rational mind, imprisoned stage by stage in the world of the 5 senses. Los, who is time, and Enitharmon, space, give embodied forms to all born into the created world, and in the fullness of time, Urizen is born as Satan, prince of the starry wheels, the mills of Satan, the Newtonian universe of which Satan Urizen is the creator, a world cut off from great eternity, the world of life. Los addresses Satan as the author of the Newtonian universe, in which, by and large, of course, we are still living, because although, in fact, there has since been Einstein and even other thinkers since Einstein, essentially we are, or rather the culture of this country, is still a material universe of which mind is only the spectator, that reality is out there. Of course, C.G. Jung has also challenged that very much. I know some of you tonight are students of Jung. So Blake writes, "O Satan, my youngest born, prince of the starry wheels, art thou not Newton's Pantocrator, weaving the woof of Locke? To mortals thy mills seem everything, and the horses of Shaddai, a scheme of human conduct invisible and incomprehensible. Get thee to thy labours at the mills, and leave me to my wrath." Satan, who is reason confined to the world of the 5 senses, protests against the invisible and incomprehensible law that guides the harrow of the Almighty in the hands of Palamabron. Since the mechanistic Newtonian universe, the dark satanic mills Blake calls eternal death, is the work of reason, we must conclude that Palamabron, who guides the harrow of the Almighty, is the contrary principle of energy or desire, who in the marriage of heaven and hell is called eternal delight, agent of the imagination, the world of life. Satan's, reason's world, is mathematical proportion of length, breadth, and height. Palamabron's is described as displaying naked beauty with flute and harp and song. There follows a lamento of the world of the 5 senses as Satan begins to build his mills and ovens and cauldrons, where the foundations of Jerusalem, the city of God, are laid in ruins. Blake saw the Industrial Revolution as the work of Satan's rationalistic, mechanistic system, and from England, where it originated, the spectre of Albion frowns over the nations in glory and war. All things begin and end in Albion's ancient druid rocky shore. But now the starry heavens are fled from the mighty limbs of Albion. The starry heavens have been cut off from life in a void outside existence. They have fled from the body of Albion, that is to say, his imagination, because the rational mind of Satan creates a space-time world outside mind and thought, where the natural world and all its creatures is supposed to exist in its own right. This is a lifeless world of objects, where the morning stars no longer sing together and the animals wander away from man. Nature has been torn apart from imagination, and Blake saw the disastrous results of creating this lifeless world. Though it appears without, it is within in your imagination, living imagination. Plotinus, known to Blake through Thomas Taylor the Platonist, argues strongly that matter has no substantial existence apart from mind which perceives it, and Blake asks, when shall Jerusalem return and overspread all the nations? It was the spiritual labor of his life to build Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land, for Blake was a true patriot of the England of the imagination. Meanwhile, Satan sets about taking over and ordering the world according to reason, with incomparable mildness and most endearing love. He pleads with Los, the time spirit, to give him Palamabron's station, truly believing in his rational system, and after repeated entreaties, Los gave him the harrow of the Almighty, alas, blamable. Thus Satan labored all day. A day is 1,000 years, at the end of which the horses of the harrow and the gnomes were maddened with tormenting fury. Palamabron accuses Satan of self-imposition. You know Satan's mildness and his self-imposition, seeming a brother, being a tyrant, even thinking himself a brother, while he is murdering the just. Satan denies that he is responsible for the fury of the servants of Palamabron's harrow, believing as he does in the supremacy of reason. Meanwhile, Palamabron has been given the guidance of the mills of Satan, and when each returns to his proper place, Satan finds the servants of the mills drunken with wine and dancing wild, with shouts and Palamabron's songs rending the forest green with echoing confusion. At this point, Elitharmon, who creates spaces, formed a space for Satan and Michael and the poor infected. Satan and Michael are the eternal contraries of good and evil as understood in the world of morality. Palamabron is in this context the contrary of both alike, good and evil being two sides of the same coin, so to speak. Palamabron is not of the moral order at all. This space created by Enitharmon is the same of which it is said in the marriage of heaven and hell, that the Messiah fell and formed a heaven of what he stole from the abyss. Milton's Messiah, according to Blake, being a ratio of the five senses. As Satan's power increases in this world, usurping the laws of life, he creates in its place the moral law. He created 7 deadly sins, drawing out his infernal scroll of moral laws and cruel punishments upon the clouds of Jehovah to pervert the divine voice in its entrance to the earth. And Satan vibrated in the immensity of the space, limited to those without, but infinite to those within. It fell down, closing Los from eternity in Albion's cliffs, a mighty fiend against the divine humanity, mustering to war. Thus from reason's mild beginnings grows this horrendous world, cut off from the divine vision of imagination. It is into this space that in the fullness of time Jesus the imagination is born, who died as a reprobate, He was punished as a transgressor. And Blake calls imagination the savior, which in terms of his mythology is to say that imagination saves from the cruel tyranny of Satan the reasoner. The transgressor is the savior, for our virtues of cruel goodness have deserved eternal death. We should remember that in Blake's London, the gallows at Tyburn, where mere boys were hanged for what we would now regard as minor offences, had not yet been replaced by the innocuous marble arch. At this point, the voice of the bard is heard for the first time, and his words are, "Pity and love are too venerable for the imputation of guilt." Others said, "If it is true, if the acts have been performed, let the bard himself witness. Whence had thou this terrible song?" And the bard replied, "I am inspired. I know it is truth, for I sing according to the inspiration of the poetic genius, who is the all-protecting divine humanity." At this point, Milton makes his entry. Recalled by Blake after 100 years, Milton undertakes to go to eternal death, the death of the selfhood and the redemption of his feminine emanation, saying, "What do I hear before the judgment without my emanation? With the daughters of memory and not with the daughters of inspiration. I in my selfhood am that Satan, I am that evil one. He is my spectre. In my obedience to loose him from my hells, to claim the hells my furnaces, I go to eternal death." The remaining 26 pages of the poem, among the most beautiful Blake ever wrote, describe various aspects of the triumph of imagination over the world of the human selfhood cut off from the divine humanity within. Milton, although generated in the vegetated world under the couch of death, is nevertheless inspired by the muses who feed him with food of Eden. Blake describes poetic inspiration in these terms. Himself, his real and immortal self was, as appeared to those who dwell in immortality, as one sleeping on a couch of gold, and those in immortality gave forth their emanations like females of sweet beauty to guard round him, and to feed his lips with food of Eden in his cold and dim repose. But to himself he seemed a wanderer lost in dreary night. And so it must often seem to men of inspired genius in this world, where the vision of higher worlds is obscured and called in question in the world where Satan the reasoner rules. In the world of generation, Satan is the limit of opacity, and Adam the natural man the limit of contraction. And to Milton, in this world, what was underneath soon seemed above. A cloudy heaven mingled with stormy seas in loudest ruin, as Milton fell into the sea of time and space. Loss, agent of time, calls his sons to the harvest and vintage of the completed time world of 6,000 years, as imagination unveils the real world of eternity. Agents of that epiphany are the four arts, poetry, painting, music, and architecture, which are the four faces of man. Blake describes how the great edifice of time is built up, and the passage concludes with an unveiling of the eternal. Every time less than the pulsation of the artery is equal in its period and value to 6,000 years. For in this period the poet's work is done, and all the great events of time start forth and are conceived in such a period, within a moment, a pulsation of the artery. The eternal world is timeless, and the inspiration comes always from that ever-present world by what Blake calls inspiration and Plato anamnesis, remembering not the time world or its history, but remembering ever-present eternity of imagination. One thinks of Dante's conception of the Divine Comedy as a whole, but whose composition occupied many years, or of Mozart, whose music came to him as a single whole, but had to be written out at length and laboriously, and of Blake himself, who in a letter to his friend and patron Thomas Butts describes his own composition of his poem Milton. For I have in these 3 years composed an immense number of verses on one grand theme, similar to Homer's Iliad or Milton's Paradise Lost, the persons and machinery entirely new to the inhabitants of earth, some of the persons excepted. I have written this poem from immediate dictation, 12 or sometimes 20 or 30 lines at a time, without premeditation, and even against my will. The time it has taken in writing was thus rendered non-existent, and an immense poem exists which seems the labor of a long life, all produced without labor or study. Yeats, Blake's editor and successor in the imaginative tradition, describes genius as a crisis that at certain moments unites the sleeping and the waking mind, which is precisely what Blake himself means by the expanding of man's infinite senses, which he blames Plato for not calling knowledge, praise an inferior kind to be called knowing. It is inspiration that discovers in a moment ever-present eternity, whereas the time world of loss is the labor of 6,000 years. But there is a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it, but the industrious find this moment, and it multiply. And when it once is found, it renovates each moment of the day, if rightly placed. Of loss, creator of time, Blake's writes, he is the spirit of prophecy, the ever-apparent Elias. Time is the mercy of eternity. Without time's swiftness, which is the swiftest of all things, all eternal torment, all the gods of the kingdoms of earth labor in loss's halls. Every one is a fallen son of the spirit of prophecy. As the eternal man awakes from the opaque and contracted consciousness of natural vegetated mankind in the satanic world of the selfhood, so the splendor of the world unfolds in an epiphany, in its full reality, from the minute to the great, and I cannot resist quoting Blake's inspired words in full. Thou seest the gorgeous clothed flies that dance and sport in summer upon the sunny brooks and meadows. Every one the dance knows in its intricate mazes of delight artful to weave, each one to sound his instrument of music in the dance, to touch each other and recede, to cross and change and return. These are the children of loss. Thou seest the trees on mountains, the wind blows heavy, loud they thunder through the darksome sky, uttering prophecies and speaking instructive words to the sons of man. These are the sons of loss, these the visions of eternity, but we see only, as it were, the hem of their garments when with our vegetable eyes we view these wondrous visions. For Blake, the world of imagination is not a world of dreams and fantasies, but this world, seen with the eyes of imagination. Or as he succinctly puts it in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, a fool sees not the same tree as a wise man sees, and the wise man is the man of imagination. This same thought Blake sets forth at length to Dr. Trussler, a patron who objected that Blake's visions of fancy are not to be found in this world. And Blake replied, I feel that a man may be happy in this world, and I know that this world is a world of imagination and vision. I see everything I paint in this world, but everybody does not see alike. To the eyes of a miser, a guinea is more beautiful than the sun, and a bag worn with the use of money has more beautiful proportions than a vine filled with grapes. The tree which moves some to tears of joy is in the eyes of others only a green thing that stands in the way. Some see nature all ridicule and deformity, and by these I shall not regulate my proportions. And some scarce see nature at all, but to the eyes of the man of imagination, nature is imagination itself. As a man is, so he sees. As the eye is formed, such are its powers. You certainly mistake when you say that the visions of fancy are not to be found in this world. To me, this world is one continued vision of fancy or imagination. The poem Milton is full of descriptions of the natural world as is seen by the eye of imagination, and it concludes with Milton in terrible majesty casting off the rational Satan in the name of inspiration. And this is like, the negation is the spectre, the reasoning power in man. This is a false body, an incrustation over my immortal spirit, a selfhood which must be cut off and annihilated alway. To cleanse the face of my spirit by self-examination, to bathe in the waters of life, to wash off the not human, I come in self-annihilation in the grandeur of inspiration, to cast off rational demonstration by faith in the Saviour, to cast off the rotten rags of memory by inspiration, to cast off Bacon, Locke, and Newton from Albion's covering, to take off his filthy garments and clothe him with imagination, to cast aside from poetry all that is not inspiration, that it no longer dare to mock with the aspersion of madness cast on the inspired by the tame finisher of paltry blots indefinite, or paltry rhymes, or paltry harmonies, who creeps into state government like a caterpillar to destroy, to cast off the idiot questioner, who is always questioning but never capable of answering, who sits with a sly grin, silent plotting when to question like a thief in a cave, who publishes doubt and calls it knowledge, whose science is despair, whose pretense to knowledge is envy. His sole science is to destroy the wisdom of ages, to gratify ravenous envy that ranges round him like a wolf day and night without rest. He smiles with condescension. He talks of benevolence and virtue, and those who act with benevolence and virtue they murder time on time. These are the destroyers of Jerusalem. These are the murderers of Jesus, who deny the faith and mock at eternal life, who pretend to poetry that they may destroy imagination by imitation of nature's images drawn from the remembrance. Unknown during his lifetime to all but a few, Blake's proclamation of the supremacy of the imagination has been heard in this century by a generation who have understood and responded to his vision of a marriage of heaven and hell. It is a vision on which there is no going back. Thank you. The turn of the 18th century saw a flowering of the imagination in English poetry as brief as it was marvelous. This flowering has left its heritage unvalued by the materialist culture of the past 200 years, but awaiting its rediscovery as, in Yeats's words, wisdom and poetry return, as he believed they must.
This will come about as it is realized that not reason but imagination is the supreme faculty, is, in Blake's words, the human existence itself. 2 centuries of materialism in the English-speaking West have brought us to a point at which, for a majority, the real world is the solid, measurable world of matter, which in its nature has no place for immeasurable realities of mind and imagination. Coleridge called imagination a repetition in the finite mind of the infinite I am, the creative power by whose agency we build our world on earth as it is in heaven, in the likeness of our innate vision. Whereas for the Abrahamic religions, man is a creature other than and external to God, for the Oriental religions, as for the Platonic tradition, and especially for Plotinus and the Neoplatonists, there is a divine presence innate in man and in all creation. Our world is real because it is the creation of the human imagination. Shelley himself defines poetry as the expression of the imagination and continues, poetry awakens and enlarges the mind itself, rendering it the receptacle of 1,000 unapprehended combinations of thought. Poetry lifts the veil from the unapprehended beauty of the world and makes familiar objects as if they were unfamiliar. Poetry enlarges the circumference of the imagination by replenishing it with thoughts of ever new delight. Imagination is a mental world, a world of which nature is a language rather than an object to be described by language. And Shelley's world is above all a world of thought. One can say that all civilizations before our own have been concerned with thought and its values. Indeed, is not the mind the human kingdom itself? The great works of the world's wisdom have been concerned with meanings and values, not with measurement of a material order. But does it, one may ask, make any great difference, since we all see and experience the world, whether we hold it to be an object external to us or an experience of the imagination? There is one great and all-important difference. To the materialist, the world is a lifeless object. To the man of imagination, the world is a living being, full of gods. For the materialist, the question is, what is nature? What are its rocks and stones and trees, earth, air, fire and water? Whereas for imagination, the question might more properly be who? Who is the west wind, spirit of inspiration? Who the skylark, the cloud, the moon? Who the rivers and trees? So it was for all the great romantic poets. Blake saw nature as one continued vision of fancy or imagination, where the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy, as in the book of Job. For Wordsworth, there is a motion and a spirit that moves through all things, and for Shelley, all lives with the life of the mind. There are subtle and fair spirits whose homes are the dim caves of human thought. The language of imagination is symbolic. That is to say, nature is a language in which ideas, moods, meanings find their correspondence, while at the same time forms of nature take on meanings. Henry Corbin, taking his thought from the Persian Sufi philosopher-poets, has introduced the term imaginal to describe the world of imagination as distinct from the word imaginary, which in modern parlance means simply unreal, non-existent. But although all thought is
All imaginative thought is symbolic. Not all symbolic thought is mythological. Thus, Wordsworth sees nature as a great epiphany of the one motion and spirit that is everywhere present. Conversely, mythological themes may be treated in a historical and biographical manner as fictions, as Tennyson's Idylls of King Arthur and the Holy Grail are treated as literal historical fact. Delightful as these narratives may be, they are not mythological in Tennyson's treatment of them, nor are they in T.E. White's The Sword and the Stone, though they again become so in David Jones's The Hunt and The Sleeping Lord. But Shelley's subtle and fair spirits, which inhabit the human mind, live and move and have their being in the world of imagination, and are for Shelley redemptive and inspiring. From unremembered ages we, gentle guides and guardians be of heaven-oppressed mortality, and we breathe and sicken not the atmosphere of human thought, be it dim and dank and grey, like a storm-extinguished day, travelled o'er by dying gleams, be it bright as all between cloudless skies and windless streams. As the bird within the wind, as the fish within the wave, as the thoughts of man's own mind float through all above the grave, we make there our liquid lair, voyaging, cloudless, and unpent. In terms of materialist definitions, invisible spirits, by whatever name, simply do not exist. They are imaginary. But if imagination is the boundless element in which we and our world exist, this world is reality itself. It is not nature that includes mind, but mind which includes the vision of the universe we call nature. To many this is simply unthinkable, but from the standpoint of every spiritually grounded civilization, it is the world of materialism that is limiting, imprisoning, and mutilating to the living spirit, preventing the caged bird from flying in its proper element. Blake's call throughout his prophetic poems is a summons to the English nation under the domination of the materialist thought whose fruit was the Industrial Revolution to awake from the deadly sleep into which England had fallen. To the materialist mentality, imaginative awakening seems illusion and self-deception, and denial thus becomes the highest wisdom for those who charge visionaries with deceiving and call men wise for not believing. Shelley's Prometheus Unbound is a celebration of the return to life and joy of a world freed from the fetters of denial by the affirmation of love. One might describe it as a poem of transfiguration through love, to use a word from Christian theology. For Shelley, as indeed for the Christian theologians, transfiguration reveals things as they really are, not less but more than they seem to the common daily mind, the world as it really and forever is. As the spirits sing, we come from the mind of humankind, which was late so dark, obscure, and blind. Now 'tis an ocean of clear emotion, a heaven of serene and mighty motion. From that deep abyss of wonder and bliss, whose caverns are crystal palaces, from those skiey towers where thought's crowned powers sit watching your dance, ye happy hours, and beyond our eyes the human love lies, which makes all it gazes on paradise. Yeats, for whom Shelley is the supreme poet, recalls that image, and Shelley had his towers, thought's crowned powers he called them once. What for the materialist is illusion, for the imagination is reality itself.
Thus all in Shelley's world lives with the life of the mind itself, of imagination that creates it. Skylark and cloud, sensitive plant, the charmed boat of the Witch of Atlas, are all living with the one life of the universe. Yeats, in an essay on the philosophy of Shelley's poetry, writes that he is certain that imagination has some way of lighting on the truth that the reason has not, and at its commandments, delivered when the body is still and the reason silent, are the most binding we can ever know. And he continues that he has reread Prometheus Unbound, and it seems to me to have an even more certain place than I had thought among the sacred books of the world. Yeats goes on to say that Shelley, in A Defence of Poetry, shows that the poet and the lawgiver hold their station by right of the same faculty, the one uttering in words, the other in forms of society, his vision of the divine order, the intellectual beauty. For, in Shelley's words, poetry is the creation of actions according to the unchangeable process of human nature as existing in the mind of the Creator, which is itself the image of all other minds. This image of the mind of the Creator is imagination, which Shelley calls intellectual beauty, as did Plato, who was himself Shelley's supreme teacher. Shelley has been called an atheist, and indeed he rejected the Christian God of the Ten Commandments as a tyrannous demiurge, as had Blake before him, but in the defence of poetry he speaks of the divine order and of the mind of the Creator, and in Prometheus Unbound makes the distinction very clear between the Creator and the moral tyrant. Asia, the bride of Prometheus, puts to Demogorgon the question, who made the living world? Demogorgon, God. Asia, who made all that it contained, thought, passion, reason? God, Almighty God. Who made that sense which, when the winds of spring of one beloved heard by youth alone, fills the faint eyes with falling tears which dim the radiant looks of unbewailing flowers, and leaves this peopled earth a solitude when it returns no more? Merciful God! And who made terror, madness, crime, remorse, which from the links of the great chain of things to every thought within the mind of man sway and drag heavily, and each one reels under the load towards the pit of death, abandoned hope, and love that turns to hate, and self-contempt, bitterer to drink than blood, pain, whose unheeded and familiar speech is howling, and keen shrieks day after day, and hell, or the sharp fear of hell. Demogorgon, he reigns. Asia, utter his name, a world pining in pain asks but his name, curses shall drag him down. Demogorgon, he reigns. And there follows a praise of Prometheus, friend of man, and a denunciation of his enemy, ending with the question, Asia, declare who is his master? Is he too a slave? Demogorgon, all spirits are enslaved which serve things evil. Thou knowest if Jupiter be such or no. Asia, whom callest thou God? Demogorgon, I spoke but as ye speak, for Jove is the supreme of living things. Asia, who is the master of the slave? Demogorgon, if the abyss could vomit forth its secrets, but a voice is wanting, the deep truth is imageless. For what would it avail to bid thee gaze on the revolving word, What world, what to bid speak, fate, time, occasion, chance and change, to these all things are subject, but eternal love. Asia, so much I asked before, and my heart gave the response that thou hast given, and of such truths each to itself must be the oracle. For the 18th and much of the 19th century, there was no recognized alternative to Christianity except skepticism. One can only describe the English at that time, and even now, as spiritually, metaphysically, and imaginatively illiterate. There was, however, another current of which the Romantic poets are each in a different way a product. This was a revival of Platonism. At the turn of the century, Thomas Taylor, the Platonist, called the English pagan, made the first complete translation of Plato's works into English, besides Aristotle, most of Plotinus, Proclus, and the other Alexandrian Neoplatonists. Shelley was himself a proficient Greek scholar, but he cannot fail to have been aware of Thomas Taylor's challenge to Christianity in the name of the Platonic theology, for it was as a religious or metaphysical alternative to Christianity that Taylor saw the canon of the Platonic writings. Taylor's contribution to a revival of Platonism was deeply resented by the academic establishment, but it was seminal among those engaged in imaginative thought, and especially the poets. Coleridge absorbed his writings as a schoolboy. He was an early friend of Blake, gave a series of lectures on the Platonic theology at the house of Blake's friend Flaxman the sculptor, appears in one of the novels of Shelley's friend, Thomas Love Peacock, and Mary Wollstonecraft, mother of Mary Shelley, was at one time his lodger. Shelley's rejection of Christianity was that of a deeply versed Platonist, not that of a skeptic. Like Taylor, he had no respect for Christian theology, and saw, as did Blake also, the moral lawgiver of the Bible as a tyrannous illusion. Shelley's vision was a larger, more philosophically subtle, more metaphysically traditional alternative to Christianity, but one not likely to be understood by his contemporaries, whether the Anglican clergy, who held absolute control of the universities, or the emerging figures of science and technology, whose material success in promoting the Industrial Revolution was to prevail. Shelley was in reality more deeply committed to a vision of man as a spiritual being than the deist clergy of his time and place. Not in the Christian doctrine of the resurrection of the body, but through traditional Platonic and Vedic doctrine of the immortality of the soul, he certainly believed. Plato's affirmation, "For who knows whether to live be not to die, and to die to live," repeated from one to another poet and philosopher of the Hellenic world, lies at the heart of Adonais, Shelley's great celebration of Keats, and elegy on his death. Heraclitus's teaching that mortals are immortals and immortals mortals is not fancy, as it can only seem to the ignorant modern West, but is an integral part of the Platonic theology. The generating soul dies from eternity into the time world to resume its native immortality at death, and it is this doctrine, not some fancy of his own, that Shelley affirms in those burning lines familiar to us all. The one remains, the many change and pass, heaven's light forever shines, earth's shadows fly, Life, like a dome of many-coloured glass, stains the white radiance of eternity until death tramples it to fragments. Die if thou wouldst be with that which thou dost seek. Follow where all is fled, Rome's azure sky. Flowers ruin the statue's music, words are weak. The glory they transfuse with fitting truth to speak. The time world, Plato's moving image of eternity, is a pale and imperfect image of the eternal world it reflects. Furthermore, in common with Blake and perhaps with Wordsworth also, Shelley clearly held the belief common to the Hellenic world, the Jewish mystical tradition, and India to this day, of reincarnation. Lines which most of Shelley's readers can only take as poetic fancy, he certainly did not intend as such. For Shelley, we are pilgrims of eternity. Symbolic images are not arbitrary signs. Light and darkness, sun and moon, wind and cloud, mountain peaks and underground caverns, dove and swan and albatross, all these correspond in the nature of things to the meanings from time immemorial associated with them, as do some human creations, towers, palaces, or Shelley's magic boats on magic journeys. Myth carries symbolic discourse to a stage further. It personifies, it enacts, and its actors are what Yeats calls the eternal moods, the gods of all pantheons, who correspond, as it seems, to, in Shelley's words, the unchangeable process of human nature as existing in the mind of the Creator. All myths relate parts of what Edwin Muir called the fable, of which every individual human story is an approximation and partial enactment. What the fable is, we do not know, only certain parts of it. Imagination is ever at work, weaving and revealing. In that timeless world, as in the once upon a time of fairy tales, as in our dreams, the laws of nature give place to the laws of the imagination, where thoughts are causes and effects magical. The psychology of C.G. Jung has restored to us at least a clue to the nature of mental and mythological worlds in which our ancestors were at home. The bleak factuality of materialist scientific doctrine is once again called into question by the imagination. In that dimension, Shelley moved habitually and with ease. Mythological discourse in Shelley unites what is in its own right imagery of the natural world, of perfect precision and beauty, with meanings on another level, that of the imagination. His Ode to the West Wind, which Tom Durham will later read to us, is at once a marvelous description of the wind and storm blowing over Italian skies, the behavior of clouds charged with electricity about to discharge itself, and wind as an age-old symbol of inspiration, of spirit. Shelley can never be faulted in those beautiful correspondences he always finds for the language of the soul. The lark is at once the bird and the soaring impulse of joy. Cloud and moon, all the scale of nature on which he played as a musician upon a keyboard, form that texture of beauty by which he knew so well how to transport us onto another plane, seldom realized in daily life, yet never remote or inaccessible. In the play Hellas, Shelley takes the figure of Ahasuerus from the medieval legend of the wandering Jew, who is the deathless possessor of cosmic knowledge.
the archetypal figure Jung calls the wise old man, who in different guises is to be found in all mythologies and visits our dreams, imparting wisdom beyond the reach of individual experience and the daily mind. How like a dream is this passage of myth. He who would question him must sail alone at sunset, where the stream of ocean sleeps around those foamless isles, when the young moon is westering, as now, and when the pines of that bee-posturing isle, green Erebinthus, quench the fiery shadow of the gilt prow within the sapphire water. Then must the lonely helmsman cry aloud, Ahasuerus, and the caverns round will answer, Ahasuerus. If his prayer be granted, a faint meteor will arise, lighting him over Marmara, and a wind will rush out of the sighing pine forest, and with the wind a storm of harmony unutterably sweet. It is not hard to understand from such passages why for Yeats Shelley is the supreme poet, uniting in his symbolic virtuosity images of the visible world with resonances of meaning and beauty of the immeasurable worlds of imagination. What as natural description could surpass the fiery shadow of a gilt prow in sapphire water, the faint meteor, and the wind that will rush out of the pine forest with a storm of harmony, the sunset, where the stream of ocean sleeps around these foamless isles, when the young moon is westering? With what virtuosity does the poet use these images as a language of correspondence, as metaphors for the soul's country? As in our dreams, each image is charged with meaning and feeling. No detail is added which does not serve, again as in our dreams, to communicate realities of another order. The time is twilight, between the sleeping and the waking, between the light of common day and the mystery of darkness, between the sleeping and the waking mind, as Yeats has described the place of imaginative inspiration. The summoner of a secret wisdom must go alone, for his is an inner journey none can share. The sea cavern doubtless signifies for Shelley the Homeric cave of the nymphs, sacred shrine where life itself issues from a source hidden in impenetrable darkness. That mysterious cave where Ahasuerus dwells is the place of the Daemonesi, daimons, spirit messengers between worlds, intelligences known in other traditions as angels, and indeed Shelley does so name them in the Ode to the West Wind, the same who on Jacob's ladder ascend and descend between heaven and earth, the higher and lower worlds. Ahasuerus, archetype of cosmic knowledge, is to be summoned from the inner realms of soul itself, as in Prometheus Unbound, Demogorgon makes Asia understand. Of such truths, each to itself must be the oracle. Ahasuerus advises the Sultan who has come to consult him to commune with that portion of thyself which was ere thou didst start for this brief race whose crown is death. None can approach that frontier without awe, without the sense of the numinous, which can be experienced but not defined. The inspired voice speaks of a mystery which is in its nature beyond the comprehension of reason. This is the realm of mythology, at once strange and familiar. Our remote ancestors moved in that world with ease, and their records are their myths. We ourselves experience that world in our dreams, in which, indeed, we should read symbolic poetry and myth as we would interpret dreams, and read our dreams as if they were poetry.
That world is no less native to us than is the world of common day, and it is the art of imaginative poetry to open to us its frontier. Shelley, that is, also understood that this imaginative dimension is in reality present as a dimension in every life, and it is for the poet to reveal its presence. In Epipsychidion, the great love poem addressed to Emilia Viviani, Shelley's passionate indignation at the thought of this beautiful young woman taking the veil as a nun arose from his vision of the sacredness of the erotic. He sees the divine beauty in the woman of flesh and blood, and in the particular woman the presence of the goddess. The brightness of her divinest presence. Oh, I think you're going to read that, Tom, aren't you? No? The brightness of her divinest presence trembles through her limbs as underneath a cloud of dew, embodied in the windless heaven of June. Among the splendor-winged stars, the moon burns inextinguishably beautiful. And from her lips, as from a hyacinth full of honeydew, a liquid murmur drops, killing the sense with passion, sweet as stops of planetary music heard in trance. In her mild light, the starry spirits dance, the sunbeams of those wells that ever leap under the lightnings of the soul, too deep for the brief fathom line of thought and sense. The glory of her being, issuing thence, stains the blank cold air with a warm shade of unentangled intermixture made by love. Paradoxically, poets are legislators of the world not because they attend to the outer events that are the concern of politicians and journalists, but because they perceive inner realities, these being the spiritual causes of natural effects. Blake's great mythological narratives are concerned with the inner condition of England's national life at the time of the French and American industrial revolutions. As a mythologist concerned with the world of causes, no poet has effected more in the world of history than did Shelley. It was Shelley who formulated the principle of non-violence as a power more potent than arms, and it was Shelley's The Mask of Anarchy that inspired Gandhi, who carried Shelley's seemingly impracticable dream into effect in a way that has changed the consciousness of the world. But greater still, I believe, is the importance of Shelley's proclamation of the sacred nature of erotic love. In the Christian tradition, sexual love was the cause of the fall of man. With Shelley, on the contrary, eros is redemptive. Rousseau had in his Confessions first made his plea for free love, and Mary Wollstonecraft, follower of Rousseau, had in her tragic life put into practice Rousseau's revolutionary principle. Shelley's second wife, Mary, was the daughter of this first feminist and of Godwin, the political theorist, whom she married, to die giving birth to Shelley's Mary. Shelley's older contemporary, Blake, had known and much admired Mary Wollstonecraft, two of whose books he had illustrated, and Blake's poem Visions of the Daughters of Albion, an eloquent plea for free love, is clearly inspired by Mary. It seems likely that Blake would have given a copy of this poem to Mary, who had inspired it, and if so, Shelley could have seen it in Godwin's house. Christianity, which exalts virginity and motherhood in the Blessed Virgin Mary, never at any time allowed a place for the erotic. For the first time with Shelley, and to a lesser degree with Keats, whom Shelley passionately admired, the erotic was to enter English poetry, not as the cause of the fall of man, but as a sacred and numinous reality.
In his choice of Prometheus as the friend of man, Shelley was to transform Aeschylus' drama on the theme of Prometheus into a celebration of the power of love. Prometheus, benefactor of mankind because he stole fire from the gods and gave it to men, was punished by Zeus, chained to a rock in the Caucasus, where the eagle, bird of Zeus, tore his liver, a torment daily renewed. In the version of Aeschylus, Prometheus was freed because he held a secret of the prophecy that Thetis, a daughter of Poseidon, would bear a son greater than his father. By revealing this secret to Zeus, Prometheus prevented his union with Thetis, who was married to Peleus, a mortal, and fathered Achilles. But Shelley was unwilling to allow the great friend of man to surrender to his enemy, the tyrant of mankind. Indeed, he had at one time thought of Milton's Satan as the heroic rebel. He changed the story, introducing Demogorgon as the son of Zeus by Thetis, greater than his father, who was to lead in a new age in which love would be the supreme power and rule the world. Shelley understood that the world of myth, of imagination, is a living, self-creating world, and to be bound by history is not in its nature. Thus, while Prometheus and Jupiter are taken from Aeschylus, Demogorgon and Asia are of Shelley's creation, in accordance with what he himself discerned of the inner changes taking place behind the history of his own age. Blake, too, had proclaimed a new age, and Wordsworth saw in the French Revolution a dawn of freedom. There is in Aeschylus' drama no feminine figure except Io, turned by jealous Hera into a cow, who in her wanderings visits Prometheus. Perhaps Io is vestigally present in Shelley's Prometheus Unbound in the form of Ione, who with Asia and Panthea, which simply means all goddess, are the daughters of ocean. In a note by Mrs. Shelley, Asia is said to represent Venus or nature. Why then is she named Asia? Shelley sets the scene of Prometheus' torment in a ravine of icy rocks in the Indian Caucasus. Now, the Caucasus range is not in India, as Shelley must have known. The location belongs not to the geography of the planet, but to the geography of the imagination. The region of Prometheus' redemption is located on the border of the India of the imagination for symbolic reasons. His beloved, his Shakti, Shelley names Asia, as if to say that the Promethean Western mind needs for its completion the feminine soul of the Orient. Asia can only be, in this context, India, for the scene of reunion of the liberated Prometheus with Asia is that far Indian vale, a lovely vale in the Indian Caucasus. The temple of Prometheus was formerly built beyond the peak of Bacchic-Nysa, Maenad-haunted mountain, and beyond Indus with its tribute rivers. The mention here of Bacchus and his Maenads is again the geography of the imagination, for Dionysus was the god of inspiration, and the Maenads are invoked in the Ode to the West Wind in this context. Doubtless it would be possible to find sources for Shelley's lovely Indian vale in travellers' tales of the forests of Kashmir, but no accuracy or inaccuracy of description is needed to account for the rich imaginative landscape of symbolic correspondence. A cave all overgrown with trailing odorous plants. A cave all overgrown with trailing odorous plants,
which curtain out the day with leaves and flowers, and paved with veined emerald. And a fountain leaps in the midst with an awakening sound. From its carved roof the mountain's frozen tears, like snow in silver of long diamond spires, hang downward, raining forth a doubtful light. And there is heard the ever-moving air and bees, and all around are mossy seats, and the rough walls are clothed with long soft grass, a simple dwelling that shall be our own. Rama and Sita built their bower in those same woods where all lovers dwell in their paradisal dream. The Ramayana is full of lovely, luxurious descriptions of incense-bearing trees and lotus lakes, for the poetry of erotic love demands and itself creates those forest glades of unspoiled nature, where the champak odours fall like sweet thoughts in a dream. Where did Shelley come to know the scent of champak? But Shelley would never have created a character so central to his greatest work from vague impressions of exotic beauty gathered from travellers' tales. What could Shelley have known of Indian poetry? Charles Wilkins, friend and colleague of Sir William Jones and friend of Dr. Johnson, had published the first translation of the Bhagavad Gita into English in 1790. Blake knew his work, and Shelley, with his interest in things Indian, would certainly have done so. But although this great poem is spoken by the Lord Krishna to his cousin Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, there is no mention in it of erotic love. But there are two works which Shelley is likely to have known, both translated by Sir William Jones himself. One is Kalidasa's Shakuntala, the story of a half-divine daughter of an Apsara, who was found in the forest and married by the king of Bharat. This work was popular and widely read in England. Goethe is said to have admired it. The other is the Gita Govinda, written in the 12th century by Jayadeva, celebrating the, I think it's the 9th century, by Jayadeva, celebrating the loves of the Lord Krishna and Radha, one of the gopis of Vrindavan. The worship of the god Krishna throughout India is associated with Radha, his beloved, with Krishna as the divine flute player who enchants and seduces the milkmaids of Vrindavan. Jones's translation appeared in the Proceedings of the Calcutta Society in 1792, and although there is no record of Shelley's having read it, it seems very unlikely that he had not. Would not the poet, his mind engaged in the theme of the sacredness of love, in naming his goddess figure Asia and situating her home in India, have had better evidence than vague exoticism for choosing India, the home of the great cult of sacred erotic love? The Gita Govinda is the source of the widespread Bhakti cult of India, of numberless paintings of the love of Radha and Krishna, of the famous circle dance performed in Vrindavan to this day, and the most widely performed theme of the Indian classical dance. The supreme love theme of India is the love between Krishna and the divine lover and Radha. The erotic images are understood on several levels, as in the Song of Solomon, the mystical union of the soul with God, but also as a celebration of the sacred nature of sexual love itself. Radha is an invention of poetry, yet has become a goddess whose myth is danced, painted, enacted, and celebrated throughout India, with temples dedicated to Radha and her divine lover. Indeed, I found myself not many years ago at the very heart of Radha's festival, celebrated on the feast of Holi at Vrindavan, where the child Krishna grew up among the gopis, the milkmaids of the
Krishna story. There is, of course, much in common between the Platonic and the Vedic traditions, but there are passages whose cosmic sweep seems to take their inspiration from the song of the Lord Krishna, the Bhagavad Gita. In Hellas, these words of Ahasuerus: "This whole of sun and worlds and men and beasts and flowers, with all the silent and tempestuous workings by which they have been, are, and cease to be, is but a vision. All that it inherits are motes of a sick eye, bubbles and dreams. Thought is its oracle and its grave, nor less the future and the past are idle shadows of thought's eternal flight. They have no being, naught is but that which feels itself to be." The Shakespearean reference notwithstanding, all that it inherits, thought's eternal flight, seems closer to India than to Plato. Be that as it may, India has always had a deep love for the poetry of Shelley, at least until secularization and westernization of Indian education began to destroy their great traditional culture. Shelley has been the most loved of the English poets. India has for Shelley a greater sense of affinity than he has ever enjoyed in his own country, save from those who, like Yeats, were themselves seekers for spiritual knowledge. Indian friends have quoted to me, as an example of Shelley's closeness to Indian symbolic thought, this stanza from Adonais: "That light whose smile kindles the universe, that beauty which in all things work and move, that benediction which the eclipsing curse of birth can quench not, that sustaining love that through the web of being blindly wove by man and beast and earth and air and sea, burns bright or dim, as each are mirrors of the fire for which all thirst, now beams on me, consuming the last clods of cold mortality." Blake, in his old age, wrote his own reflection on those who live on earth as if it were already that other timeless world of mind or spirit, which to imagination is more real than the shadowy world of cold mortality. He was surely remembering, besides Thomas Paine, those young revolutionary idealists who used to meet weekly at Johnson's bookshop in St. Paul's Churchyard when they were all young, among them Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, and his words apply no less to Shelley, child of that revolution. Many persons, such as Paine and Voltaire, with some of the ancient Greeks, say, "We will not converse concerning good and evil, we will live in paradise and liberty." You may do so in spirit, but not in the mortal body as you pretend, till after the last judgment, for in paradise they have no corporeal and mortal body. Shelley affirmed the sacred nature of sexual love, and his attempt to live by that vision bruised himself and has ever since been condemned by those who live in the real world. But to Shelley, the vision was more real than the world of cold mortality that has judged him, and he believed that someday the world will live according to the truth of the imagination, under the rule of love. In his great poem, which Yeats names among the sacred books of the world, he gave that vision its vesture of poetry as a reality of the human spirit already realized. Thank you.
From the Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. The day becomes more solemn and serene when noon is past. There is a harmony in autumn and a luster in its sky which through the summer is not heard or seen, as if it could not be, as if it had not been. Thus, let thy power, which like the truth of nature on my passive youth descended, to my onward life supply its calm, to one who worships thee, and every form containing thee, whom, Spirit fair, thy spells did bind to fear himself and love all humankind. The chorus of Greeks captured by the Turks proclaim the glory of Greece that shall return. The world's great age begins anew. The golden years return. The earth shall like a snake renew her winter weeds outworn. Heaven smiles, and faiths and empires gleam like wrecks of a decaying, dissolving dream. A brighter Hellas rears its mountains from waves serener far. A new Peneus rolls his fountains against the morning star. Where fairer Tempes bloom their sleep, young Cyclades on a sunnier deep. A loftier Argo cleaves the main, fraught with a later prize. Another Orpheus sings again, and loves, and weeps, and dies. A new Ulysses leaves once more, Calypso for his native shore. Oh, write no more the tale of Troy, if earth death's scroll must be, nor mix with lion rage the joy which dawns upon the free. Although a subtler Sphinx renew riddles of death Thebes never knew, another Athens shall arise, and to remoter time bequeath, like sunset to the skies, the splendor of its prime, and leave, if naught so bright may live, all earth can take, or heaven can give. Saturn and love their long repose shall burst, more bright and good than all who fell, than one who rose, than many unsubdued. Not gold, not blood their altar dowers, but votive tears and symbol flowers. Oh, cease! Must hate and death return? Cease! Must men kill and die? Cease! Drain not to its dregs the urn of bitter prophecy. The world is weary of the past. Oh, might it die or rest at last? I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Too vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." Ode to the West Wind. Oh, wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing, yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes. O thou, who chariotest to their dark wintry bed the winged seeds where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave, until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion o'er the dreaming earth, and fill driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air, with living hues and odours plain and hill. Wild spirit, which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, hear, O hear. Thou, on whose stream, mid the steep sky's commotion, loose clouds like earth decaying leaves are shed, shook from the tangled boughs of heaven and ocean, angels of rain and lightning, there are spread on the fine surface of thine airy surge, like the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce Maenad, even from the dim verge of the horizon to the zenith's height, the locks of the approaching storm, thou dirge of the dying year, to which this closing night will be the dome of a vast sepulchre, vaulted with all thy congregated might of vapours, from whose solid atmosphere black rain and fire and hail will burst. O hear, thou who didst waken from his summer dreams the blue Mediterranean where he lay, lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams beside a pumice isle in Bai's Bay, and saw in sleep old palaces and towers quivering within the waves' intenser day, all overgrown with azure moss and flowers so sweet the sense faints picturing them. Thou, for whose path the Atlantic's level powers cleave themselves into chasms, while far below the sea blooms and the oozy woods that wear the sapless foliage of the ocean know thy voice and suddenly grow grey with fear and tremble and despoil themselves. O hear, if I were a dead leaf thou mightest bear, if I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power and share the impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou, O uncontrollable. If even I were as in my boyhood and could be the comrade of thy wanderings over heaven, as then, when to outstrip thy skyey speed scarce seemed a vision, I would ne'er have striven as thus with thee in prayer in my sore need. O lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. I fall upon the thorns of life. I bleed. A heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed one too like thee, tameless and swift and proud. Make me thy lyre, even as the forest is. What if my leaves are falling like its own? The tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both a deep autumnal tone, sweet though in sadness. Be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit, be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth, and by the incantation of this verse scatter, as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? And from the elegy to Keats, the Lord, Adonis, Adonai, Adonis. He is made one with nature. There is heard his voice in all her music, from the moan of thunder to the song of night's sweet bird. He is a presence to be felt and known in darkness and in light, from herb and stone, spreading itself where'er that power may move which has withdrawn his being to its own, which wields the world with never wearied love, sustains it from beneath and kindles it above. He is a portion of the loveliness, which once he made more lovely. He doth bear his part, while the one spirit's plastic stress sweeps through the dull, dense world, compelling their all new successions to the forms they wear, torturing the unwilling dross that checks its flight to its own likeness as each mass may bear, bursting in its beauty and its might from trees and beasts and men into the heavens' light. The splendors of the firmament of time may be eclipsed, but are extinguished not. Like stars to their appointed height they climb, and death is a low mist, which cancels not, which cannot blot the brightness it may veil. When lofty thought lifts the young heart above its mortal lair, and love and life contend in it for what shall be its mortal doom, the dead live there, and move like winds of light on dark and stormy air. The one remains, the many change and pass. Heaven's light forever shines, earth's shadows fly. Life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity until death tramples it to fragments. Die, if thou wouldst be with that which thou dost seek. Follow where all is fled. Roam's azure sky, flowers, ruins, statues, music, words are weak. The glory they transfuse with fitting truth to speak. Why linger, why turn back, why shrink my heart? Thy hopes are gone before. From all things here they have departed, thou shouldst now depart. A light is passed from the revolving year, and man and woman. And what still is dear attracts to crush, repels to make thee wither. The soft sky smiles, the low wind whispers near. 'Tis Adonais calls, O hasten thither. No more let life divide what death can join together. That light whose smile kindles the universe, that beauty in which all things work and move, that benediction which the eclipsing curse of birth can quench not, that sustaining love which through the web of being blindly wove by man and beast and earth and air and sea burns bright or dim as each are mirrors of the fire for which all thirst now beams on me, consuming the last clouds of cold mortality. The breath, whose might I have invoked in song, descends on me. My spirit's bark is driven, far from the shore, far from the trembling throng, whose sails were never to the tempest given. The massy earth, the sphered skies are riven. I am borne darkly, fearfully afar, whilst burning through the inmost veil of heaven, the soul of Adonais, like a star, beacons from the abode where the eternal are.